situation.
And want to get some input back from each of you. We're going to be sending a survey out at the end of the Legislative Learning Lab on Monday. But I hope you've enjoyed this so far. I hope it's been good content. I know today's content is going to be equally amazing with the speakers that we have, and we hope this is beneficial for what you were seeking out of this. I'm going to put over in the chat section. Please share your thoughts about yesterday, because I want to make sure that if this was not what you were expecting, that we can adjust to meet some of the needs that you might have as far as what you wanted to learn from this. And we do have the recording up and available. I believe Miranda emailed it out to everybody yesterday, and we're going to have that available soon on our website if it's not already there. And Lacey, Keith Gaddy has asked if you could allow him to share slides. He has slides for his presentation.
He should be able to do screen share.
Excellent, thank you. I've got a lot of friendly faces and names I recognize on here this morning. So welcome back, those of you that were here yesterday. We're sorry that there was a conflict with the Oklahoma Policy Institute event. We worked with them to make sure that we could get this recorded. So those of you that attended their event yesterday would be able to go back and watch the recording from what we discussed yesterday. So we didn't want to harm each other's organizations. And Chris, thank you very much. Very much appreciate that. And I was on a call with Leslie Gamble yesterday with AAA. I think she referenced 3 different things we talked about yesterday in our discussion on seatbelts. So I'll do a little bit of lobbying here. We're working to try and change the seatbelt law in Oklahoma. As I said, there was a Scrivener's error where when they changed it from age to height and weight a few years ago, they inadvertently took out age, and therefore Oklahoma is the state with the youngest age requirement for wearing a seatbelt. 8 years and up to 17, you do not have to wear a seatbelt. And so that's something we're trying to get corrected and improved. Before it was up to 12 years old. We're trying to get it from 0 to above 17. And of course, adults have to wear seatbelts. So we're working on changing that. Senator Peterson has a bill in the Senate. Representative Ford has the bill in the House, and we're working to try and get that changed. So any advocates that are interested in that, please reach out on trying to get that seatbelt law passed. And if you've looked at the agenda for today, we're going to start off with an amazing speaker talking about how we got where we're at. And I'm not doing the lead in for him yet. I'm just going to run through the agenda. But Dr. Gaddy does a great presentation. I've seen it with Leadership Oklahoma before, talking about how Oklahoma is where we're at as far as our political landscape. And there's some interesting points in our history that certainly have led to the development of our views overall as a state, especially by region. And then following that, we're going to have a conversation with 3 lobbyists at the Capitol, professional paid lobbyists, who are each going to talk about the different aspects of what they work with and effective tips of what they use, working with clients and also working with lawmakers and policy makers in the agencies to see changes come about. And then we're going to have a conversation about redistricting and the importance of that. And then we're going to wrap up with the name everyone associates with OICA, Ann Roberts. Ann was the executive director for 20 years at OICA and saw some amazing things happen at the Capitol. And she's going to talk about how to do the research on legislation when you're looking for bills, looking for ideas, tips on how to effectively go through and do your homework before you have your meeting. And so, Lacey, why don't you go ahead and kick us off with our first video?
USA? Do you know about the government? Can you tell me about the Constitution? Hey, learn about the USA. In 1787, I'm told our founding fathers did agree to write a list of principles for keeping people free. The USA was just starting out a whole brand new country, and so our people spelled it out, the things that we should be. And they put those principles down on paper and called it the Constitution. And it's been helping us run our country ever since then. The first part of the Constitution is called the Preamble and tells what those founding fathers set out to do. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. In 1787, I'm told our founding fathers all sat down and wrote a list of principles that's known the world around. The USA was just starting out a whole brand new country, and so our people spelled it out. They wanted a land of liberty, and the preamble goes like this. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America, for the United States of America.
I miss the good old days. I miss growing up on those cartoons. And I'm sure you can see there's a theme with where we're starting off each morning. We played the most famous one yesterday, and that one certainly is one of my favorites. I want to start off on a little bit of a lighter note, just reminding us we all learned from these cartoons when we were kids, and hopefully we will be able to pass that along with the work that we're doing through this Legislative Learning Lab and the work that we do as advocates. To understand how we got where we're at and where we're going, we need a little bit of a history lesson. And I can't think of a better Oklahoma political history professor than Keith Gaddy, who goes around lectures, and that's obviously no slight to Dr. Bob Blackburn. He's retired. Keith is still drawing a paycheck. So Keith is one of those amazing historians who's not even from Oklahoma, but he gets it as far as where we're at with Southern political history and the formation of our state. So I want to turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Keith Gaddy. Keith, are you with us?
I think he had a little bit of technical difficulties.
Uh-oh.
Joe, my screen had frozen up, so I had to leave the valedictory you were giving me. I'm sorry about that.
All good words.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. Am I on?
Kick things off here. We're ready for you.
Okay. Well, first of all, it really is a pleasure to be here and see everybody this morning. And my dear friend, Joe Dorman, one of the oldest and best friends I have in the state of Oklahoma, despite his predilection for orange and black. The only man to ever get me into orange and black on a Saturday, I should take note of. There is photographic evidence. But Joe, I appreciate the introduction. I appreciate everybody being here today. We're going to go a lot of places today. And where I want to start is actually briefly, I am going to pop into some slides that support the conversation I want to have with you all today. But one thing I learned in doing instruction for a number of years to military officers is that there's this thing called death by PowerPoint. I think we're all familiar with it, and I'm not going to do death by PowerPoint to you today, but I do have some slides and some visuals I'll need to share with you midway through this presentation. The first part, unfortunately, is largely going to be me just talking to you and doing a little bit of storytelling to set us up. But when I think of Oklahoma, I always think of Eugene O'Neill, the Irish-American playwright and actually noted communist. Actually, Eugene O'Neill hung out with a bunch of communists and socialists before, during, and after World War I. But he made the observation, there is no present or future, only the past happening over and over again now. And if you want to understand Oklahoma, indeed, if you want to understand the United States, you need to understand that quote, that the past just keeps recurring and it echoes forward, and we're constantly dealing with it. And I'm sure all of you 3 weeks ago saw the events at the US Capitol. It was hard to miss. An insurgency is a difficult thing to miss. The revolution was televised. But it actually brings up an interesting point, and it's going to be my starting point for talking about Oklahoma. Is I'm going to go to 1917. I'm going to go to 1917. And I'm going to talk with you about the current Oklahoma Capitol building, which was built at that time and has just completed a beautiful restoration. Trait Thompson, who has taken over the Oklahoma Historical Society after finishing running that renovation, took me on a tour and was telling me about the building. I teach on the architecture faculty now, so this was an interesting tour for me. And if you go to the old Capitol building and you go up the traditional front stairs on the west entrance, and you make your way up the stairs, there are two beautiful great doors there, right? Two beautiful, huge doors. And they're about 4 inches thick, okay? Big, beautiful, thick, heavy doors. And they're on heavy rollers. And if you look off to either side of those doors, on the there on the front of the Capitol, there are these two sort of pivot hinge mounts sitting there. And no one really ever bothers to ask what those are or why they're there. So I asked Trey, I said, what's the deal with these? And Joe, I know you know the story. It's a good story. He said, well, said Keith, when they were designing the Capitol building, there was a great deal of unrest on the Mexican border. And Pancho Villa was riding up and down the Mexican border with Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. And there was a fear among lawmakers and members of government that somehow the Mexican Revolution would make its way 600 miles through Texas to Oklahoma. And if it arrived in Oklahoma and the Mexican revolutionaries attacked the state capitol, that they wanted to be in a position to defend it. So these heavy doors have got steel inside of them. They slide shut and lock shut to prevent anybody from broaching entry to the building. And off to the side, these are gun mounts that can mount 3.5-inch howitzers. So we are prepared to defend the Capitol as a fortress if the Mexicans were to ever invade. That was part of the design element. It was a conscious decision. And telling the story reminds us of a variety of things, and it helps us understand the development of Oklahoma as we know it as a modern state, which is, even though this is an ancient land populated by ancient people, and in that respect, actually has a tradition and a set of challenges to address the future where we might learn things from Australia and New Zealand. As much as there was an ancient people here, it is a place of people who have been displaced or have moved to take a second chance. They moved to take a second chance. This is where the frontier ended. This is the last territory organized by the US government as US territory. It is the last part of the Louisiana Purchase to be formed into a state. Edward Everett Dale, the early 20th century historian at the University of Oklahoma, who has a building named after him, 2 buildings named after him, in fact, Dale Hall and Dale Hall Tower. He observed once that Oklahoma was stitched together from the leftover remnants and garments of every state made around it. And the consequence was you got a state that was geographically diverse, it had diverse flora and fauna, and it also had a tremendous cultural diversity that came into it. And I am going to show you a map of Oklahoma now, just to give you some context so you can eyeball, but I'm going to then use that map in a different context in just a moment. So give me a moment. One thing Joseph, give me a show of hand if you agree with this. One thing that we have learned in this year at the university is that every Zoom presentation, to some extent, is going to be a little bit clunky and awkward. Okay, especially once we get into interactives. Okay, so you should be able to see this slide that has the Eugene O'Neill quote that I brought up. Right, Joe, is that coming through? Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Now you should now be looking at a slide that says Native American. Is that coming through? Okay, good. Okay, so this is a map of Oklahoma, and the shading on this map is by voting precinct in the state. According to the U.S. Census's 2019 American Community Survey data, the percent Native American in every one of these precincts. Okay. But what's handy about this map is it kind of gives you a sense of, I can walk you through and talk to you about the settlement and the disruption of Oklahoma, okay? Which is that if we were to draw a line from roughly here, just above Ponca City, south to the east of Oklahoma City, to the east of Norman, and then jiggering a bit over towards Duncan, okay? And Joe, actually, we just went by your house in Rush Springs also. I should take note of that. Everything to the east was known as Indian territory, and from 1889 forward. And these are the lands that were essentially ceded to, granted to, or which were thrust upon the 5 civilized tribes that came from the American Southeast, the so-called civilized tribes, termed as such by American history because they had a history of industry, written constitution, governance that seemed familiar to European powers and to European settlement. Everything to the west of that line was organized as Oklahoma territory, except for the Panhandle, which was never organized, at various times called either no man's land or Cimarron territory. Okay, so that's the recent history. That's the recent plat, the traditional plat that we put over Oklahoma, okay? We have to recall, though, that in moving into this space and in organizing this space for settlement, for farming, for the forced relocation of the tribes by Jackson from the east, we displaced an indigenous people that was here. So there are multiple waves of disruption and conflict that are created by the creation of this place as organized territory in the United States. And it has consequences carrying forward. This is part of the general narrative of American history, though, okay? The approach I've always taken to studying American politics as a trained political scientist is what's called an American political development perspective. And APD emerged about a half century ago and was viewed by some people as being a conservative approach to studying political science and politics and American politics because it tended to use rich descriptive history and a careful examination of the interplay of different social forces in history rather than using a bunch of data and statistics and modeling, which is actually the tradition that I came out of in political science. But what APD contends is that the creation of institutions and the crafting of the Constitution cannot be separated from the racial component of the founding, okay? They simply can't be separated. That to understand the American Constitution, you have to understand the role of slavery. To understand the American Constitution, you have to understand the treatment of and the designation of the native peoples of North America, okay? And to understand the subsequent development of US states, territories and states, you have to understand the role of race, the role of segregation, the role of religion in shaping those institutions, the role of sex in shaping those institutions. So we go and we look at the 19th century, it's a period of tremendous protest and disruption, okay? And the women's suffrage movement, the abolitionist movement, and the prohibition movement all come to the fore and grow in the same period of a second great awakening in the United States. So there's a moral religious subtext to this effort to confront the dominance of white men and a narrow band of power and the crafting of institutions to reinforce the status quo, okay? Seemingly conservative, but it actually feeds into understanding why we have conflict in society, and it feeds into understanding why we shaped our constitutions, federally and state constitutions, the way we did, and then why we are constantly struggling to change them, okay? And the current debate in the United States and in Oklahoma is in part this ongoing tension between an old traditionalism, okay, which basically predates the progressive movement, and efforts to broaden the franchise, broaden the full application of rights and liberties to people in the United States, and indeed to broaden the concept and definition of citizen, okay? We don't fully acknowledge citizenship rights for Native Americans in the United States, for example, until 1924, okay? So all this is taking place in the shaping of America. And it shapes Oklahoma as well, very much so, because Oklahoma is created both as territory and as state, gets formal Western organization as part of the United States in this period from the 1880s to the 19 teens, which is an era of tremendous disruption and upheaval in the United States. And when we look at Oklahoma, what we see are a whole series of competing forces and tensions at work, because this is, in a way, truly the West. When I moved here from New Orleans, I figured I was just coming to another part of the South. It seemed to fit. Oklahoma had a lot of the hallmarks of being Southern. And then I thought, well, maybe it's Southwestern. And then I got thinking about it. And after 25 years, I concluded Oklahoma is actually the West, indeed the purest version of the American West. Given the way it came into the Union, its long period in territory status, the tensions and forces at work in this state, it is truly Western, truly of the American West. But the American West is of the American South. Now, a lot of people will push back on that and say, well, look, Keith, you say the West is of the South, but the South had all those race problems, right? You had the Ku Klux Klan, and you had all those tensions that arose from that. You had the Civil War, and that was the South. But we fought the Civil War out here. 15,000 people died in Oklahoma during the Civil War. We forget that. But our institutions were influenced by the South, as was the entire West. The American West is fundamentally a product of an outmigration, largely of Southerners after the Civil War, to the American West. And a lot of the institutions that were created in many of these states, but they're most visible and plain in Oklahoma in 1907, are Jim Crow institutions. Oklahoma is the only state to ever come into the Union segregated, and also to come into the Union dry. So segregated and no liquor, okay? Which reflects one progressive tension, right? This pushback against alcohol as a bane of human existence and a source of spousal abuse and family decline and social disorder, but also a pushback against the consequence of the Civil War, pushback against Reconstruction and the reinstitution of a racial order that's subjugated not only African Americans, but also Hispanics and Native Americans, not just in Oklahoma, but throughout the entire West. So we come into the Union in 1907 out of the marriage of two territories, using a recycled constitution written by a fella by the name of Alfalfa Bill Murray, who, after crafting this constitution initially for the state of Sequoia, which was meant to be the eastern half of Oklahoma, rejected by Congress because Republican Congress was afraid of bringing a Democratic state in with two Democratic senators. Constitution's recycled a year later becomes the foundation of state government in Oklahoma. I'm also increasingly convinced that Alfalfa Bill Murray demonstrated what is known, what is often said of great artists and great writers. It's said that good writers copy, great writers steal outright. And Alfalfa Bill, in putting together the Constitution of Sequoia and of Oklahoma, borrowed liberally from state constitutions around the United States and cobbled them all together and created a progressive, populist document. And what that document did is it distrusted anything big. Tom Cole, Congressman Tom Cole, has always said that in Oklahoma, you can afford to be big on about 2 of 5 things, right? You can be big on government, you can be big on God, you can be big on education, you can be big on labor, or you can be big on business. You can afford to be big on 2 of these 5 things, but if you're big on 3, Oklahomans will not stand for it. And a progressive constitution, a populist progressive constitution does 2 conflicting things. It asks government to do a great deal of things for individuals, okay? So it carves out all these agencies to do things. And so you have a government agency to deal with almost every aspect of the economy and every aspect of life. But it also calls on government to bust up its power because it doesn't trust a strong executive. And so, whereas in some states, such as Virginia or Kentucky, you'd have a relatively strong governor with a great deal of authority over state government, in Oklahoma, we busted up state government to about a dozen state-level agencies, each headed by a different elected official, or by an elected commission, such as the Public Service Commission, okay, or Corporation Commission. The consequence is that each constituency in the state has somebody in government looking over them who they can then attempt to co-opt. So that makes change very difficult in this state because the executive is weak, because the government has been fragmented into 1,000 pieces, and there are oversight boards over every agency. And this tends to reinforce the status quo and tends to protect the status quo in government. The upside is it afforded a lot of opportunities to run for public office and a lot of opportunities for people to serve in public office, and leads to Oklahoma actually having a tradition, among other things, of having a relatively young government. We've elected probably more governors in their 30s in the 20th century than any state in the United States. So this effort by Bill Murray to create the state constitution that has every novelty and every bell and whistle in it creates a document that's in constant need of change. And because we have an initiative and referendum in there, we can change it. And the consequence is, Joe, I think we have now the second longest state constitution in the United States behind Alabama. So as usual, we're just trailing Bama, right? We're just behind Alabama in all this. We'll get there. But yeah, we have this state constitution designed for a white majority, which came largely either out of Kansas and the Midwest, Central Europe, or Texas and the Deep South. The settlement patterns of Oklahoma rely highly on in-migration. And when the white population comes, it either comes from the Deep South, Texas, Kansas, and the Midwest, or it comes from Central Europe, which is how we end up with places like Prague and Bismarck among our town names in the state of Oklahoma. We also get the Ku Klux Klan, which at one point in time actually has effective control of the state legislature. And we have an anti-Klan governor elected in 1922 by the name of Jack Walton, who ends up getting himself impeached and removed, the first of 2 consecutive elected governors of the state of Oklahoma to be impeached. I believe Jack Walton's also the last Oklahoma City mayor to be elected governor of the state of Oklahoma. The reason I bring this up is the reason the Klan was powerful was that there was a desire to enforce the norms of segregation and also enforce other norms of general conservatism and of a conservative morality. And either the Klan or America First clubs formed during World War I and co-opted by the Klan were often the vehicle for doing this. So when we look at Oklahoma, yes, it is West. Yes, it is new. But it is in many ways created at the beginning of the 20th century an echo of Jim Crow and an echo of the segregationist South, and indeed continues as a segregated state into the 1950s when court orders integrated public education in the state, and Oklahoma did not massively resist. When you build a society and a culture in this manner, and when you police this line, and probably the most notable policing of this line is the Greenwood Massacre in Tulsa, which I'm not going to belabor today. There is plenty written on this, and if you ever get the chance, buy Randy Crable's book. The Tulsa World journalist Randy Crable has written a wonderful book on journalists covering the Tulsa Massacre, the Greenwood Massacre. OU Press came out last year, award-winning book, probably the best story told so far. Also, we will be programming this year and next year through University of Oklahoma to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Greenwood. So keep your eyes peeled for that. When you have events like this, which were not unique, and then you make them disappear, it says something about culture, okay? What it tells us about the culture is that the culture undertook these actions, but they don't want to acknowledge them. And they're probably carrying through a legacy of it, okay? Carrying through a legacy of trying to police what Earl and Merle Black called the color barriers of society and trying to maintain the status quo. But by the same token, there's also a certain social guilt that accompanies this. I still remember in 2004 going in to teach a senior level seminar at OU and being informed by a student that the Tulsa Massacre had never happened, Greenwood had not happened. It was all basically fake news, and he knew this because his grandfather told him. And I handed him my late colleague Danny Goebel's 240-page report on the Tulsa Massacre and said, okay, let's visit later. Never heard back from him. But this acknowledgement of history and acknowledgement of diversity and the consequences of actions are increasingly dominating the space of Oklahoma as well as the entire United States. And much of the unrest we've seen the last few years is a direct reflection of this. Now, that is admittedly a somewhat charged, overly broad and sweeping narrative that I've given you, okay? Probably too sweeping. There's a lot of backfill that has to go in behind that would take semesters to cover. Well, what I want to do now is I want to go back and I'm going to drop into the slide deck. And I want to take some time. I want to walk you through how different Oklahoma has become over the last quarter century and why addressing these challenges of institutional order and organization, of simply being honest with history and how we might do that constructively, why these things matter, okay? And then I'm going to try and, Joe, am I going to have time for Q&A if I do this right?
Yes.
Okay, good. And we'll leave some time for questions. Either just put them in the chat or we can have people pop in, whatever you prefer. Okay, so real quickly, the main thing we need to know about Oklahoma is that it is growing much more diverse and it's growing much more urban. Okay, and this is the most common talk that I give around the state these days, is that this state is rapidly changing. And there is a world of difference between the memory and experience of people my age and older, I'm 55, and people under the age of 40 in terms of what is Oklahoma and what is their society. So briefly, these slides are simply showing the racial demographic distribution of the state, okay? Native American, African American, primarily concentrated in Oklahoma City, Tulsa, okay, and to a certain extent Lawton, and Hispanic. And one thing you'll notice is that in Western Oklahoma, there has been a phenomenon going on for about 30 years called the browning of the plains, okay, which is that as over time, as agriculture and meat processing jobs became increasingly dominated by Hispanic and migrant populations, these populations became more permanent. And in their permanency, have grown up a citizen base, initially in Texas, but also in Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado, okay? And in Oklahoma, this has taken place primarily in portions of Tulsa over here, the Oklahoma City and Bethany, okay? But especially the Panhandle and Southwest Oklahoma down here around Hollis, Greene County, this area, okay? Indeed, Charles Ortega, the first Hispanic member of the state legislature, came from down here near Hollis, a Republican lawmaker. But each of these maps hides something more interesting, which is the general diversity of Oklahoma. Oklahoma is about 64% Anglo-white, okay? 64% Anglo-white, which means that our white population share is roughly comparable to a state like Alabama, okay? And to the extent that we have a non-Anglo-white population, it's highly diverse. There is no one predominant minority group in the state of Oklahoma, unlike in majority Hispanic Texas, where the predominant minority group is now Anglo-whites, or in a state like Georgia, where 32% of the population is African American. If you look at this map, it tells you something about the next map, which is the precinct level vote for governor in 2018 in the state of Oklahoma. And if you look at this and you think about party politics, this is where I get that common reaction. Well, my goodness, look at all that red, right? Look at all that red. And there is a lot of red out there. The bottom has fallen out on the old rural Democratic machine in Oklahoma. It's gone. The idea of a rural Democratic lawmaker is also gone. There is no rural Democratic lawmaker south of I-40 in the state currently, which is unprecedented. That's never happened before. But the Democrats are running strong in Tulsa. They're running strong in Oklahoma City. They won for a single term the Congressional District 5, which was composed of Oklahoma County up here around the big blue dot, and also Pot and Seminole. But here's why change will come. This is the population density of every county in the state. And we have two huge screaming office towers full of people, Tulsa and Oklahoma counties. And they're only growing. And they're only going to get stronger and stronger over time. And the next census will bear this out. This map shows population and population projections starting in 2010 for 2020, 2035, and 2075 in the table, okay? Which shows that depending upon how you measure an urban area, whether you just look at the three core big city counties, which are Norman, Oklahoma City, and Tulsa, or if you look at what are called the metropolitan statistical areas, come the next census, probably 6 in 10 Oklahomans will live in a metro area, okay? Probably up to two-thirds might live in a broader metro area if you also include Lawton, which is in decline, unfortunately. But if you look at the map, what's going on in the map? To the extent Oklahoma has gained any population in the last 10 years, 90% of all population gain is in the dark blue counties. 10% of population gain is in the foam green and the light blue counties. The red counties have actual net population loss in the last decade. They're actually hemorrhaging people. They're losing population. And in those counties also, a young person is far less likely to go on to college than if they are in one of the major metros or in one of the suburban counties surrounding the metros, okay? If you're in a non-growth county and you're a young person, not only are you in an area where there are no jobs, or rather, excuse me, where there is no growth, the odds are you're probably not going on to pursue higher education or even vocational education. Far less likely in these red counties do we have any effort by young people to pursue additional education or professional development. It's probably the single most glaring discrepancy in the state, and we've got to deal with it. Okay. Another thing, I've just threw this in here because I was looking at it. If we look at the poverty data in the state, poverty rates are still far higher among African American, Hispanic, and Latinos. If a child lives in poverty, the odds are they're in a female-headed household with no husband. Okay. And the odds are that if you're in a female-headed household with no husband and you're a child, over the last 12 months, half of them spent some of that time living below the poverty level. 1 in 2. Okay. 1 in 2. Now, the reason I bring this up is when we look at the future, one thing we know about the demographics of Oklahoma youth is they look like the demographics of America. Okay. They look like the demographics of America, and they think like the demographics of America. Okay. We have a larger Native American population share, a smaller African American share. Our Hispanic share is roughly on par with the United States. Okay. And these data were originally assembled for a briefing that I did at OU in my capacity there. But what I want you to see is I'm going to show you 2 graphics. One is basically a demographic comparison of 17-year-olds in Oklahoma and Texas. Okay. And one thing we see is that in Oklahoma, about 55% of all 17-year-olds are Anglo whites. Okay. The next largest group, though, are Hispanic. And these kids are overwhelmingly citizens. Okay. These are not dreamers. These kids were born here. Okay. They are Americans, and they're going to be Americans, and they're going to be voters someday. Followed by African Americans and the Native Americans. You look across the river at Texas, half of Texans under the age who are 17 right now are Hispanic. Okay. Texas is about to undergo a more fundamental shift than we are in terms of its population makeup. But if you want to understand Oklahoma in 20 years, you should always look at Texas now. Okay. In terms of demographics and in terms of cultural and economic and political challenges, because we're in the diversification space that Texas was in 10 years after the IT bust of the 1980s. Okay. Here we go. Why this matters. This graphic shows the demographic makeup of Oklahomans based upon what year were they 17. Okay. Were you 17 in 1960? Well, guess what? 83% of people your age in the state are Anglo white. Were you 17 in 1990? 68% of the people who are your age in the state are Anglo white. Are you 17 today? It's 54%. 17, 10 years from now, 53%. The Oklahoma of our children doesn't look like the Oklahoma of our parents at all. It is fundamentally, culturally, demographically different. It's urban, it's suburban, it's diverse. Okay. Fundamentally different. And not just in terms of its technical cultural makeup, also how they think about things. They've got a more diverse worldview. They're far more liberal and internationalist. They're part of a global communication environment. My daughter, who's now in grad school at University of Georgia, precocious 21-year-old, when she was 15, she had an Instagram account writing poetry and stories that had 25,000 people following it. She met her boyfriend as a teenager through that account, and they're still together. It's a very different world for these kids. We all know this. We all encounter it. But if you look at their issue positions, these young people in our state and around the country are far less likely to consider race. They're far more progressive on gender issues, on LGBTQ issues, even among the conservative kids. They're more oriented to economic justice. And here's the other one that really hurts when we have to talk to our grandparents. They're far less evangelical Christian, okay? They're far less likely, they're more likely to be unchurched. But if church, far more likely to be either a Catholic or to have gone to a traditional mainline. They've wandered away from the Baptist church and the non-denominational evangelical churches of their parents and grandparents. They are carving out a different path and creating a different Oklahoma. They want a more activist government. The data I'm showing you here are from a Pew Research study that came out about 2 years ago. They want government to be activist. We've seen this in the protests that have happened in the state in the last year, where there have been demands for change, and demands that change come from government. But where the difference really shows is on issues of immigration and race. Okay, these data come from an organization called the Policy and Religion Research Institute in Washington, D.C. And the director of research there is an OU alumna named Natalie Jackson. She's probably one of the sharpest young pollsters under 40 in the U.S. And this national survey, if you look at the light blue box in the northwest corner, that block shows the points where people under the age of 25 cluster on the variety of questions that are off to the right. They are far more liberal in their belief that demographic change is positive for the United States. They don't think immigrants cause more crime. They're opposed to building a wall. They think that having immigration strengthens American society. They are opposed to a Muslim travel ban. They're opposed to putting limits on legal immigration. And they don't think that immigrants are a burden on local communities. Okay. Then if you look at their parents and grandparents, who are off here onto the right side, you see that except for one question, the agreement that immigrants are hardworking, that immigrants are a model minority. Well, they're very hardworking people, right? Except for that one question, the parents and grandparents are far more conservative on all these issues than are the kids under 20. If you look at the race issues, symbolic racism, the same thing. Impact of slavery, seen as far more detrimental among younger Americans than among older Americans. That the killing of African American men is part of a broader problem, right? That over the past few years, the Black community have gotten less than they deserve. The Colin Kaepernick question, should you require an athlete to stand for the national anthem, right? And just say, I worked in college football when I was in grad school, and I care about what happens between the lines on the field, and that's about it. So I'm just going to give you my bias on this one, but also removal of Confederate monuments and the role of Confederate monuments, and do they symbolize racism? These kids have a much, much more liberal perspective on balance, much more progressive perspective on balance, and see the need for change on these issues far more than their parents or grandparents. These perceptions of unfairness transcend party, okay? Young Republicans, young Democrats both find that are far more likely to find that Blacks are treated less fairly by American society than any other generation of Americans, regardless of party, okay? So this creates potential generational division in the GOP right now, which is going to be important going forward. They're far less likely to buy into the notion that anyone can succeed in America, but they believe in their own abilities. They don't buy into conventional labels to identify themselves that were used by our generation or the generation that preceded us. They don't think of themselves in terms of capitalism or socialism or even patriotism. They don't buy into the labels that are often used to frame politics. Okay. They also have a more accepting view of the world and don't see the United States as being necessarily qualitatively better than everywhere else on earth. So they're not buying into what's called the thin narrative of American exceptionalism. This is a fundamental departure, again, from the parents and grandparents. As I indicated, they're more likely to be unchurched. Actually, unchurching in general is a trend in Oklahoma. Oklahomans in general are less likely to go to church. Evangelicism is down in this state. It's never had a decline before. It's in decline. And then finally, in this generation, they are far more progressive on gay and lesbian issues, far more progressive, leading to yet another generational division. And so I wanted to expose you to that material because when we look at the conversations we have in politics in the state, part of what our lawmakers need to figure out, and our lawmakers are primarily Gen X or baby boomer, or older Gen X and baby boomer often. Oftentimes when they're framing on issues or framing on solutions to issues, we don't know if they're engaging where the future is. And we don't know if they're engaging where the future electorate is. Well, the one thing we do know is that in Oklahoma, as in the nation, the future electorate is very different from the one that's immediately past. Okay, Joe, I think that leaves me about 10 minutes for questions.
That sounds good.
Okay, and I'm sorry if I turned into an auctioneer there, throwing all this at you. You always got to get the lecture in, right? It just
The
so
best
you
part
know,
is we're recording this so people can go back and watch it again.
at their own pace. So very Montessori of you, Joe. I like that. And actually, just to give you a quick caveat, I did a number of years as a litigation consultant in politics, and probably had 3 times as many Republican clients as I did Democratic. So this one thing I was always able to do was I've been able to generally lay aside a preconception in order to do an objective analysis. That's always my goal. Okay. And this is simply the future as I see it from an analytic perspective. This is where the blinder is that we need to deal with, because we're going to be called upon to address and deal with a lot of echoes of the past in the state by virtue of how it developed.
I want to put you on the spot and ask one question from a former president of the University of Oklahoma. What is the level of percentage of funding coming from the state for higher education from when he first started in government to when he ended? Do you remember that?
Well, when David started, this would be David Borden and not Jim Gallagly, clearly. And actually, to clarify, my main job at OU is I'm special assistant to the president of the university, and I've served 3 presidents. David Borden observed that when he came into state government in 1966, a majority of the money that funded the University of Oklahoma came from the state appropriation. So a little bit more than $1 and $2, right? It's now 9%. It's 9%. For the regional colleges, they're getting a bit more of their budget. But the thing with OU is we have a national brand, and we are capable of functioning effectively as a private university, but there's a consequence, and it's a dire consequence. Our student body looks like the state. Our student body is 54% Anglo-white, 16% Native American. Okay, the in-state portion of our student body. The third that comes from Texas looks about as you'd imagine. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. But 2/3 of our student body comes from households that make over $120,000 a year. And our biggest challenge is we're trying to find ways to make college more affordable for more people. And that's what the Crimson Commitment was about. If the state gives us money, our hope is that we can actually cut the cost of going rather than expanding the scope of what we do. But nonetheless, we're going to expand the scope of what we do without raising tuition because we'll find some way to pay for it. And it's what we do. We're an enterprise. Joe, I
wanted to throw that in there because people ask about the Bernie Sanders movement and the discussion about waiving student loans. Mm-hmm. I'm 50 years old this year, and I finally get to pay my student loans off completely next year.
Well, Joe, down here at OU, we love to win at softball, and you threw me a nice big fat one right over the plate. I appreciate that. Okay, all kidding aside, questions?
We've had nothing but raving compliments over here in the chat section. Appreciate you bringing this perspective, and that's exactly what I wanted people to know as far as how we got to where we're at, and you touched on all those elements.
Well, I appreciate it, Joe. I really do. I'll tell you what. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna shill for 2 of my books real quick. One is one that's been out for about 5 years. It's called The 3 Governors Controversy, and you can get it on Amazon. And it's about a situation in the state of Georgia in 1947 where 3 different men claimed to be governor. And it was going to court, but also the National Guard, the State Guard, and the state police each lined up behind a different governor. War correspondents were sent to Atlanta thinking that there might be armed conflict in the street for control of state government. Okay. And the guys who ran the Georgia recount, I went to school with. I went to school with Gabe Sterling, who you may have seen him on CNN again last night. But if you give that a read, it's a fun read. It's a colorful read. But the other one is I've got a new book coming out from OU Press called The Supreme Court's Democratic Spaces, and it's a sort of an artistic and theoretic examination of not just the current Supreme Court building in Washington, but also the court's previous homes in the U.S. Capitol and also in Philadelphia and in New York. And that'll come out from OU Press this fall, and that's my first book in architecture. But yeah, so if you want to get a sense of what I'm up to right now and have a fun read that's got beautiful illustrations and learn the story of why those buildings mean so much and why when you see people storming through the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol doing what they did, why it would offend somebody like me, that book will tell you why. Winston Churchill said that first we shape our spaces and thereafter they shape us. And that was his argument for rebuilding the House of Commons after the Nazis bombed it in 1941. And restoring it exactly the way it was, because there's blood in the wood and blood in the stones. And we put that there in order to live in peace. And so I'd give it a look. I'd appreciate it. Any questions, please?
We've got some great ones over here. First,
Okay,
I'll ask,
yeah.
what about Oklahoma's movement and the federal discussion about universal child care? I know we were really top in the state as far as early childhood education with 4-year-olds, partly through private funding, partly through the legislators at the time. But
yeah,
what do you see as far as a shift there?
I don't know. I think Oklahoma would come late to the game unless we do it through initiative. Because in Oklahoma, if we want to change anything that involves bringing additional federal funding, it tends to involve initiative, right? That's how we dealt with the funding of rural hospitals finally, right? Is went after the Medicaid money, went after the Medicare money. It's the people are going to have to do it themselves. The thing is, I think here's the thing I'm going to say. I've got a lot of confidence in this legislature's leadership. I think they've done a really good job the last year under trying circumstances. And I also have a prejudice in that John Eccles and Greg Treat, I've known them since they were both about 19, and they were in my classroom. And they seem to be men of conscience, and they actually came to govern. I think Charles McCall is like that as well. Government's going to have to govern. And there's a reason why we're there, right? Anything beyond that's politics. I don't think we move unless we move through the initiative, though. I think it's just too tough.
We have one last question I'll ask, and then we want to give people a couple of minutes for a break.
Yeah.
What are the possible long-term effects of the deprofessionalization of school teachers with the increase of emergency certification?
Well, I think we saw the consequence of this in particular focus. I think teachers should be paid a lot more for 2 reasons. One is better people will come to teach, and second, those who are there will be more motivated to do their best possible job. Okay, nothing says appreciation like money. Okay, it's in the marketplace. Money is the love, right? Job security is the love, but people also want accountability. They want to be held to a standard of excellence, and if you reward them with real tangible rewards that are not merely symbolic, not $500 here or there, I think the consequences of increasingly relying on emergency certification, it's I don't know, just if you ever go back and you watch Little House on the Prairie, it's sort of like when Nellie Olson's mother would have to show up and substitute teach. Lord knows what you're going to get, right? But let me step back though. The people who are stepping up to teach who are not certified, they're stepping in to do a job we need them to do, right? And if they're good at it, we need to make them better, and we have to allow them to professionally develop, right? We have to acknowledge the effort and the sacrifice in that space. We've got to do better.
Especially with what we're seeing right now with so many teachers unable to go to the classroom because of the pandemic. And the pandemic is has led to some areas for improvement with technology, but certainly we're seeing some devastating impacts for children.
Can you imagine trying to corral 24 6-year-olds on a Zoom call? I mean, it's hard to imagine. And they all have to have their cameras on, and you're trying to get their attention. I have a co-author who has a 5-year-old. She's trying to dean a college and homeschool at the same time. I can't imagine. I don't know how they do it. But I will make a call out for one thing. If you didn't imagine the need for more expanded and annualized civic education, you just saw it in the last 3 months, okay, or the last several years. You can't expect people to act like Madisonian Republicans if they're not trained and taught to be Madisonian Republicans, okay? It's as simple as that. If we're not teaching people to be the kind of Americans we aspire to be, including recognizing the problems of the country and the Republic warts and all, you shouldn't be surprised when a bunch of nuts show up and try and burn the place down. That's not the articulate end I wanted, Joe, but I'm going to take it. Guys, I'm 1 minute over. I appreciate your time. Have a good break and have a good conference. Joe, I can hang on here for a second if you need me to.
One answer I'd like for you to type into the section while we give people a 5-minute break so they can run to the restrooms. Someone asked, of the 5 pillars, silos that Tom Cole referenced, which 2 would best fit child advocates in Oklahoma? Which one should they focus their efforts on, do you think? I know where I fit, but I'm abnormal in that category.
Yeah, I think you focus on business and government, because business has to learn that if parents can succeed and if children can succeed, business will succeed, right? Business is simply a consequence and extension of who we are in society. Without consumers, there is no economy. Without an economy, there is no business. So that'd be my take. So I'm going to type that in.
And they want links over here for where to find your books.
Okay, I'll tell you, I will copy and I'm just going to paste you to my Amazon page real quick. Is that okay?
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to take care of that right now. All righty.
And everybody, go ahead and consider this your 5-minute break. We'll start back in just about 3 or 4 minutes. And Dr. Gaddy, we'll go ahead and stay and casually chat while people take that break, and then we'll kick it into the next segment.
Excellent. Joe, how are you?
Now that this conference is going forward and it's been so successful, very much more relaxed.
Yeah. Oh, I'll tell you what, man, it's how you guys put on stuff like this is beyond me. Trying to put together an online conference like this. Is the format generally working though?
It is. This has been fantastic. I will tell you, going forward, we've done this 3 times in person. We're going to do this online virtually by Zoom forevermore. This has been a way for people to be able to attend. You don't have to come to a site and take a full day off. You can just take a few hours off to do this. And the flexibility for the speakers to do it this way has been fantastic.
Well, I'll tell you what, Joe, I'm sorry for pivoting a bit on you. I couldn't dig up the foundational material I had from the previous talk. So I kind of use it as a setup to go into this stuff. But this is material I think it's important for people to hear. And we need our lawmakers to be aware of it. We need our decision makers to be aware of it if they're not. Because this is our future marketplace. These are our future employees. These are our future voters. And they're not just going to stand there and be told what to do.
That's exactly right. Could you repost the 5 different things that Tom Cole mentioned?
Oh yeah, yeah. And again,
Hey Joe,
Sherry.
we're just chatting. Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Okay, so here's something that years ago when my husband and I were much younger, we realized that our friends in college who tended to be more liberal, and we were both raised conservative, that as we matured and advanced through our careers and made more money and viewed things differently, such as how much we're being taxed, things like that, we have noticed those individuals are now conservatives and registered Republicans. With this younger generation, do you see that trend happening as perhaps as financially we progress, we become, our ideology shifts?
Was that to me?
Yes.
Yeah.
It can happen. I mean, here's the thing. If a person is young and they vote in 2 consecutive elections and they vote with that party for 2 straight elections after being mobilized, they're probably with that party for the rest of their life. A lot of folks our age, I'm 55, and a lot of folks our age, say from late 40s, if you're say from 50 to mid 60s, it's possible you started out as a Democrat, but the Reagan Revolution, the collapse of the Carter presidency had a profound impact on moving a lot of people to the right and moving them into the GOP. Unfortunately, we've seen a similar type of collapse and effect happen in a presidency, except this time it was a Republican president. And I'm firmly of the opinion that, and like I said, I made a lot more money off the GOP than I ever did off the Democrats, okay? But I'm firmly of the opinion that the Trump presidency has not done much to move these voters. The one place where we saw a tangible movement by Trump on a segment of the electorate was among Hispanic men, okay? Which is important. That's important. But otherwise, it's going to take a profound failure by the Democrats and by the Biden administration, which could happen. They've promised a lot. They have to succeed on pandemic to get the opportunity to succeed on everything else. And if you don't succeed on pandemic, you're in horrible trouble. You're in horrible trouble. And I think that's ultimate, I think that is probably the principal reason that mitigates against a broad-based realignment to the right out of these younger voters. I still believe, as I believed for 20 years, that the GOP could just get off of immigration and get past the latent Jim Crow echo of bringing the Jim Crow conservatives into the party in the 70s and 80s, that they could be a solid, multiracial, multi-ethnic, diverse majority party. But they've got to get past that. They've got to move past that, and they're still kind of hung. But they've got to win with a candidate who's willing to do that. And I think George W. Bush wanted to go there. Karl Rove wanted to run I'm gonna have to dash him. I've got Board of Regents in an hour up in the city, but George Bush wanted to run a guest worker program in 2001. They're going to roll it out October 1st, 2001, and then 9/11 happened. And then they tried to ramp it up again in 2003 and could get no traction because the country had ticked hard on immigration, in part as a consequence of 9/11. That was 20 years ago. Maybe it's time to give it another try. But for the last 4 years, the party has been staked out as the hard anti-party, as the isolationist party. So I'm not sure how you make that pivot. Making inroads with Hispanic men is certainly a start. Okay, I could do this all day, Joe. I got to get in the city. Take care, guys. Good to see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. And we're going to go ahead and kick over to our next. And we're a couple of minutes over, so I'm going to dispense with introductions other than say we have 3 phenomenal lobbyist advocates who are going to be here speaking with us. One is a lifelong friend, another is a lifelong friend, and the third is a lifelong friend. So I've known these people for quite a while as far as my political times. I've known Haley since her college days when she was at OSU, and briefly worked in politics and decided to go to the lobbying side. Chad and I started on campaigns at the exact same time on competing races, and he is one of my board directors and I'm the employee, so I can tell you he picked the winner back then and I picked the runner-up. And then as I spent my time in the legislature, Dino Cox was the lobbyist for the service area for AT&T in my area of the state. So we got to be really good friends through his work on different areas. And I'm going to turn it over to each of you right now just to give a brief introduction about yourselves, and then let's get into the questions. Haley, let's let you start since you're on my screen.
Absolutely. And Joe, can you hear me? I always like to start with that before I get going. Perfect. My name is Haley Flood, and like Joe said, I've actually been involved in this kind of a world for quite some time now. I work at A&E Advocates. I'm a partner with that firm. It was founded by Dennis Adkins, who is a former representative as well, just like Joe. And we specialize on working with companies and organizations as they are trying to cut through the red tape that is state agencies and contract with state agencies, and then also on things that impact them at the legislature. So very excited to be here today, and we are super pumped about the things that OICA has on board for this year. And I really hope we get to talk a little bit about a really big win that we had with OICA and the UpChapey events and things that are going on around the state. So looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Next, Dino Cox.
Oh, well, good morning, Joe. Thanks for the invitation. Look forward to the discussion. Dino Cox, I've been with AT&T for 40 years. Go back to Southwestern Bell and SBC. I've been around the nation and done a lot of different things. Joe and I have been friends a long time, and I spend my life at the Capitol managing our legislative affairs now. You might ask why AT&T cares about legislation. Well, there's a plethora of reasons, from taxes and broadband. I'm sure we'll get into some of that. A lot of other reasons. This big aircraft carrier that I'm on cares a lot about different things to help the state move forward in a positive way. So I'll leave it at there. I've been around the nation with AT&T, but I'm glad to be back home where born and raised. So Joe, I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, sir. And one of my favorite former board members, Mr. Chad Alexander.
Hey, Joe, how are you?
Doing great.
Yeah, I started in politics, as Joe said, back in 1994 with J.C. Watts' campaign for U.S. Congress. I worked for him for 8 years and then served as state chairman of the Oklahoma Republican Party from 2001 to 2003. And then after that, I founded my own political consulting and contract lobbying business. And for the last 5 years, I've been a talk show host, except for 6 months because of COVID, from 4 to 6, hosting a show on 1520 AM and 95.3 FM.
Well, thank you to each, the three of you. And I want to start off by doing a little bit of a definition of lobbying. We have several different aspects of lobbying as far as the different people we see at the Capitol day in and day out. Simply put, you have contract lobbyists, you have lobbyists that work for an entity, and then you have lobbyists that work for associations or advocacy groups. Chad, could you talk a little bit about a contract lobbyist?
Yeah, I could. And I mean, to put it simply, we're pretty much hired guns. That's just being honest. Different corporations, different entities. I've worked from everybody from the University of Oklahoma to the Boys and Girls Clubs to RJ Reynolds. I've represented the liquor wholesalers since 2004 now. The three-tier system is very complex and highly regulated in Oklahoma. There was a time where we looked at about 6 to 10 alcohol bills that would be filed in the legislature. We're now up to about 60 a session, from 6 to 10 in the last decade. And so we do a lot of complex issues there and regulatory issues there. And so, alcohol modernization was a big topic. There was 2 years of negotiation involved in that. Stephanie Bice took it on as a freshman senator and did a phenomenal job. And it took a couple of years, but brought all the parties together to kind of invest and remodel their businesses. But being a contract lobbyist, it's a relationship business. Everything in politics is a relationship business. And thankfully in Oklahoma, we don't see as much of the polarization as we do in Washington, D.C. of course, the minority party is always going to, put out their agenda, push back, and I mean, that's what democracy is all about. It should be, but it seems here it's a lot more civil. I mean, I'm great friends with many in the Democratic legislature, just like I'm great friends with you, Joe. And so it's not as bad here as it is as what we see in Washington, D.C. We see a lot of good bipartisan bills a lot of times. Colin Walkie and Josh West filed a bill together. That's a good bill this year. It's a bipartisan bill. When we're talking about hemp laws, when hemp is not intoxicating or mentally hallucinogenic, even though it's a cousin of marijuana, Nikki Dollins and John Eccles put a lot of work into getting hemp legalized in Oklahoma. So we do see a lot of bipartisanship in Oklahoma, but at the end, it is a relationships business. And one of the things about term limits that I think was an unintended consequence is it took a long time to become a committee chair. You had to be there a while. Now, sometimes you will see somebody in their sophomore year is going to be, a chairman, especially when 75% of the House or 80% of the House is in their first or second term. People don't stay around as long as they used to. And, you have to remember that, first of all, elected officials are people, and it really is public service. And you know this as well as anybody. It's a very thankless job for not a lot of money. And so I think, realizing that one, they're human and have a thankless job for not a lot of money is always needs to be in your mind when you deal with the legislature.
Could not agree more. Dino, could you talk about working specifically for one client, one company? Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. Still getting used to Zoom and WebEx and all those things. You bet. Yeah, as I stated earlier, I'm 40 years with AT&T, and I've worked in every department. So been 21 different places from sea to shining sea, and so my knowledge is all strictly AT&T. And when I was saying earlier about working with the legislature and all the things that how it affects AT&T, one of the big things. Chad's very intelligent and a friend, and he brought up, a bill that Walkie and Representative West have running. It's a 1602 privacy bill. We can talk about that. There's a lot of issues with that. I might be on a different side, and that's something we can also get into when friends are opposite directions on different issues. But from an AT&T standpoint, I'm focusing just on my one client, where Chad and other lobbyists have a plethora of different clients that they have to juggle different aspects of that. I concentrate a lot of different issues, and now this year is more prevalent. We've looked at social media legislation, social justice or injustice legislation, inclusion, where Senator Young has filed a bill to create a commission to look at that for the state of Oklahoma. Those are all really good measures that try to help this state move forward in a positive way. We'll look at, we can surely talk about broadband. That is, as the speaker said, it's one of his top priorities. The Pro Tem has shared that as well. That's one of the very top priorities that we have. We can talk about the measure was filed last year to create the Oklahoma Rural Broadband Expansion Council. We can talk about those things, but in a nutshell, my whole focus is for AT&T and how do we help the state move forward positively on a number of different fronts. And I can go through a lot of that, Joe, but that's in a nutshell, a good summary.
Good deal. And I'm going to make sure we cover all of the issues that y'all are working on, child-related areas, when we get towards the end. Haley, I left you for last because you have to deal with a lot of the poor clients, the advocacy groups, and there are also groups like the American Cancer Society out there that have people like Lisa Foster. Could you touch on the way they handle things and the way you handle things?
Absolutely. And yes, I've obviously worked with OICA, so I have a lot of work in representing an organization. Prior to becoming a contractor and working at A&A Advocates, I was also deputy director of the Oklahoma Public Employees Association. So I've also worked internally for an association. And I would say it's some of the funnest work, to be quite honest. And it can be some of the most powerful advocacy that we see at the Capitol, because you have the power of grassroots advocates. And that's where OICA's strength is. You guys that are on a lot of these calls, the folks that join our weekly updates, the folks that we reach out to join coalitions like Up Chafee, you see the power that comes from being in an organization like this. And the thing that I always tell you guys whenever I speak to you, and I know that a lot of you guys have heard me on the calls and such, I'm one person. And yes, I have those relationships, and those relationships that Chad spoke to are extremely valuable because it gives me the insight to know who the message needs to go to and how to make that message resonate. But at the end of the day, you are the constituents. And when you work with organizations and you work with associations, you get to do the grassroots elements of making sure that those constituents are talking to their local legislators and reaching out on that community level. And in my opinion, that's the most powerful tool that you can have, is actually being a constituent and being a member of the legislator's local community and bringing in that local voice.
Absolutely. We'll start off, a lot of people are really not sure what a lobbyist does. They know they go to the Capitol, they pitch ideas for bills. I want each of the three of you to go through basically a daily routine throughout the year. It's not just during session. I know y'all work year round. Haley, talk about what your daily routine is, and then Dino, and then you, Chad.
Yeah, and it depends on the time of the year, quite honestly. I've heard the analogy that it's almost like a sports team. And we have our off season and we have our on season, and off season is the interim, and our on season is obviously when session is going. So a lot of our ability to really dig into issues and work with our grassroots advocates and do a lot of research, you're going to see those things on the interim. So that's when we're working with legislators in their local communities. And I would say legislators are also not part-time. Every legislator that has served understands that, and we try to advocate for that. Your local leaders are working 24/7 as well. But that's when we're in the community. That's whenever we're really doing the hard research. The legislators are doing interim studies. And so it's a little more calm and it's a little more controlled and organized. And on a day-to-day basis during the interim, we kind of know the things that we're working on. My answer for what my schedule is like during session is I don't know until like 5 minutes before I start doing something. It's kind of like being a plate spinner is what I would say. Things go so fast and furious during legislative session that I feel like I'm constantly trying to keep one issue from not crashing and running from issue to issue. And so that would be my thing on during session is, we've prepared your issues at that point. You've got the advocates lined up, and it's all about being a plate spinner and running from issue to issue and dealing with it, day to day, quite honestly.
That's true. And Dino and Chad, y'all have two different methods of doing outreach to the communities. Dino, talk about your day-to-day activities, and then what AT&T encourages y'all to do in the communities.
It's a great question. And, we'll start in, I will start obviously in January and start as far as from the legislative point. I will start, reading bills this year over 3,100 measures that we'll look at and determine out of those 3,100, what are directly and indirectly affecting AT&T. I'll compile a list. We've got, again, this large aircraft carrier, so I'll send it to subject matter experts around the nation, find out how we care about that, what our stance is, and what our direction on each one of those issues. We have what we call external affairs managers around the state, and they will handle different parts of the state, and they will be assigned so many legislators. So every legislator has an AT&T contact assigned to them, where Dino will just handle the Capitol and the Oklahoma City legislators. So we will go through that. We'll have a list of bills that we will monitor. We will find out what's going on, what do we want to do with it, our stance and take. As you go through the session, and that modifies, your stance modifies as amendments are introduced and so forth. As Haley talked about in the off time, in the off session, past May, and even during session, these managers around the state are involved in their Chamber of Commerce, involved in boards of directors on various different boards in their individual communities, getting to know those legislators intently. Do they like hamburger, hot dog? Do they like red or orange? Do they wear socks, knots? Whatever it is, to get to know that legislator very well, to have that personal relationship with that legislator. And so be able to talk with issues with them one-on-one. It's very important. We've been doing this for a very, very long time. Been in the state, about 130 years or so. We spend a lot of money and invest in the state. And so in the last 3 years, we spent over 800 million to build up the network on many different levels. So those managing the state will tout that and talk about the things that are positive with AT&T, what we mean to the state of Oklahoma, what we do for the state of Oklahoma. And not just besides the legislation, we do a lot of things to help organizations to grow, nonprofits, and Haley speaks so proudly as she is. She's a wonderful person, a wonderful advocate for what she talks about. We're very good friends. So it's 10 words or less in a nutshell. But from AT&T standpoint, again, there's a lot of things that affect us that directly affect our customers. And we can talk about that, but you want to look at your taxes on a bill and you wonder it may be AT&T doing that. There's a lot of different things that go into that. So and I'm excited to bring up broadband once we get into that.
Absolutely. Y'all
kudos to AT&T. They care about kids so much, and I see it all the time. I love Dino, and thank you guys so much for caring about the community.
Yeah, full disclosure, y'all are good supporters and sponsors for the Heroes Ball. We appreciate you. Chad, you have pretty much 2 full-time jobs, lobbying and then educating the masses on the radio. I know your day-to-day planning activities go well beyond session. Could you talk about yours?
Yeah, and then, I have corporate clients that I do public relations strategy for, that I'm not a registered lobbyist for them. It's just a strategy. And then I have a political shop as well. I mean, there's some races I've turned down because they actually are running against an incumbent Democrat, but those incumbent Democrats are friends of mine. And so I stay out of those races. So I really run a lot fewer races than I used to. There would be a time where I would do 17, 18 races in one election year, and that's probably filtered down now to just 2 or 3, because you see a lot of what's going on in Oklahoma right now with 82 Republicans in the House. You see a lot of primaries, and for the incumbents, a lot of them are my friends that I have a relationship with, so I have no desire to do that. And so, but I mean, when we get talking to session, I like a lot about what both Haley and Dino said, but I kind of refer to a session as organized chaos. Yeah, it's 16 weeks, but we start with a shotgun start. We have a deadline in House for House Committee and a deadline in Senate for Senate Committee. As soon as we're done with that deadline, then we're on the deadline to get out of the House where the bill originated, whether it's the Senate or the House, they have to cross over by the timeline. Then we start the committee process over again. And we're on another deadline to get our bills out of those committees and then get them to the floor and try to get them to governor. And then we have this conference committee process, which most states don't have a conference committee process like we do. And then anything can happen with titles struck in that section of law. So you've really got to watch those bills. So really, it's almost deadline to deadline to deadline to deadline. And echoing what Haley said, no matter what I had planned for that day, you see a committee sub drop and it changes the legislation. That's all you're working on that day. And you didn't know before that committee sub dropped that was what you were going to be doing that day. I think there's a camaraderie between the lobbyists in the building. I think there's a camaraderie even with the legislators in the building. And one thing I'll say is no session is the same. Every session is different for different reasons. When there is a budget shortfall, people are not happy because somebody's going to have to take cuts. The legislators aren't happy about it. And so I would say a lot of times you have to gauge the mood of the legislator at a time. There have been many times I've been sitting in a legislator's office waiting to visit with them. And I could tell by they walk in and their demeanor, come back later. Right now, they're looking to say no to someone. They just came out of a meeting and they are not happy. And then when there's an abundance of money or more than we thought was going to be there, then everybody's fighting for, their clients that have appropriation clients. They're trying to get their piece of the pie. And so, depending on the economic situation and what's going on out there, you don't know one thing to another. I would say, like I woke up this morning, I start reading the news, obviously, like everybody else. And I had an email in my box that there was a holdover in education funding of almost $1 billion. And that Mark McBride, the chairman of Subcommittee Appropriation and Education said, why do we have over $982 million in holdover funds? And of course, there's reasons with the pandemic, with things closing in March, you're going to lose a lot of overhead. And, Drew Hoffmeister had some very good comments of, a lot of these people are holding over money, and they did have some reduced expenses because of the pandemic, but we don't know what the next year or two is going to look like because of the economy and the shutdowns and things like that, which is a very sensible argument to make. But, now that is going to be a topic of conversation that's going to be going on at the legislature that we didn't know about last night. And that's how fast things move. And I also say the misinformation, that's the radio part of it. Man, we need to do a lot better job of civics classes because it is so easy. People call in with misconceptions about the Electoral College or what the president or the vice president could do with the Electoral College votes. And so I would always say, when you're dealing with legislatures, never present them with bad information. All we have out there for our relationships and our credibility is telling them the truth. You're not going to last very long as an advocate if you're giving them bad information. And sometimes you may not intentionally be giving them bad information, but with social media and fringe websites that appear to be legitimate news, you pick something up you think is real. But if you give legislatures the bad information, those legislators are never going to probably trust you again, and they're going to talk to other legislators. So it's a mad scramble and a rush out there, and we're on deadline to deadline. But I think always just remembering that their elected officials are people too. It's a pretty thankless job, as I said, for not a lot of money, and they're just doing their jobs, and they have emotions just like we do.
So we had Claudia Swisher talked about the relationships. She was glad to hear you talk about that. I want to ask each of you, and Dino, you start this one off. What is it that makes a successful lobbyist at the Capitol? Chad touched on relationships. What else is out there? And certainly, I think that's one of the most important ones. I want to turn it over to you. And you're muted.
Joe, I think what Chad just said, and I was thinking about that and he's obviously pretty fantastic at what he does, and Haley is no exception incredible. To me, the biggest thing, it comes to integrity, and that means a lot to me. Very seldom will I, and underneath the dome, very seldom will I use our three letters. It's almost irrelevant to me, because the issues that affecting AT&T, they affect every company that provides the services that we do. So I don't really pinpoint on AT&T, but the knowledge that I have is important. What Chad just said, making sure when I talk to Representative Dorman and I tell him the issues, I don't have to wait for the vote. I can provide the information on a topic to him that is pertaining to AT&T and why it's important for his constituents for him to vote one way or another. And my integrity is everything. That the representative or senator will listen to me. And Chad's right. I've been lucky. I haven't messed up a whole lot, but I mess up one time, and it's like breaking an ice cube. I don't know. It takes a long time to put that back together. But being successful is knowing what you're talking about, understanding the issues, being able to communicate. When we're in school, the children are in school, it's amazing. And I've talked in several of these forums. They don't teach us how to listen. They didn't teach us way back in the 50s and 60s when I was there how to listen, and how to communicate, how to effectively communicate. Now, certainly, as you grow older, you can have different colleges, read different books and all those things, but everybody's communication style is a lot different. And so, I'm just an old phone man, and I can talk about phone business, but certainly, my integrity, my honesty, it means more underneath that dome than anything else to me.
Chad?
I couldn't agree more. I think Dino said it great. You're like I said, your name is all you have. And if you mislead a legislator, you don't wing it. Obviously, I'm not an expert on everyone who hires me. As a contract lobbyist, I may just get picked up in March for the rest of a session to help their normal lobbyist because they have a big issue. So I'm not an expert. So if I go see a legislator, they ask me a question I don't know the answer to, that's not the time to BS. That's not the time to try to make yourself look smart, because if you give them bad information, you've got a problem. And I've been out there before when I've sat down with a member and say, well, this lobbyist told me this, and I found out that's not true. If they're saying that to me, they're also saying that to other members of the caucus. So then you're going to have people, you know, kind of looking at you with one eye all the time because you gave them bad information. And to me, that is a vital thing. And he mentions the integrity out of it. All we have is our names out there. And even dealing with other lobbyists, I can tell you last year, there was a bill I was against, but there were several other lobbyists that were against that bill as well. Well, I went to the lobbyist who represented the client that was trying to get the bill passed. And I said, I'm just being upfront with you. My client's against this bill. This is why my client's against this bill. And I want you to know up front, it's nothing personal. They're against it. I have to work against it. But there are several other lobbyists out here that are working against your bill too, that are hiding behind me. And I want you to know that it's not just me. Some other people are getting involved in this. So if you hear information or you see something that gets handed to the author of the bill, don't assume I'm the only one out here giving them information, because there's 3 or 4 others that are working this bill as well. And you have to protect yourself that way, because it can be a false assumption that you go to them and you tell them you're working against something, or you tell the member that you're working against it and why. They understand you have a job to do, that you're representing the advocating for your client. They respect you more when you're upfront and honest with them. If they think you're someone's just going to run around stabbing people in the back, no one is going to have a good relationship with someone they feel that way about. And so I think that's very, very, very important. And I couldn't say any better than Dino has. And Dino and Haley have both been out there a long time and understand this. And I don't think any of us will probably disagree with anything the other's saying, because there are a lot of unwritten rules we have out there in the commodity of how things work in an organized civil manner.
Haley?
Definitely what they said. The only thing I would add that I think has helped me, and I've grown in this as a lobbyist, quite honestly. I think in my younger years, I probably wasn't as good at doing it, but patience, I think, is very, very important up there, and understanding. And especially with the areas that we work in, I mean, I know the legislators, there's no one up there at that Capitol that wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to go hurt kids today. That does not happen. There's no one that intentionally runs a bill to harm children. But what we can see is that maybe there's not an understanding of best practice. Maybe there's not an understanding of trauma and what our kids in Oklahoma are going through. And so to not have a knee-jerk reaction and turn somebody into the enemy, but instead to be patient with them, to go in and have an understanding that they've probably heard something, or they, are doing something for a constituent and have been working on something, to have the patience and the understanding to go and have those discussions and bring another side to that story can really make a difference, as opposed to some of the venom that we see on a national level and all of the infighting. So I would just add some patience and understanding can go a really long way to finding out where an issue is coming from, and then bringing really good information to them from the other side.
And I know I take up a significant amount of your time by you talking me off the ledge from having more patience. So I appreciate that. Sometimes I grow a little bit.
The venom and the passion.
Sometimes I grow a little bit impatient with the people out in the big white building with the dome. So want to ask from your experience, how can advocates benefit from having a lobbyist help them? Kind of a pitch for Chad and Haley about looking for more clients, but what does a lobbyist bring to the table for an association or an effort? And Haley, will you start off?
Yeah, I think we've already hit it. A lot of it's the relationships. We know these folks, we work with them on a daily basis, and the ability to resonate and know what is important in their lives, what is important in their community, which constituencies are driving certain issues. I think that's always important. And the other thing that I would say, and I think that, Chad and Dino would probably agree, you can have a wonderful policy idea, but unfortunately, and I say this all the time, I stole it from Dennis, it's Dennis's line, my business partner, you can't take the politics out of politics. And that's what we are. We're political experts. Yes, we understand your policy. Yes, we can articulate that. Yes, we can help you message that. But when you've got a bill that your bill author won't vote for another bill that's in a committee that you don't follow because it has nothing to do with you, and your bill author just killed their bill and now they're trying to kill your bill, even though they think it's a wonderful policy idea, but the politics are getting such that you're seeing those things. We see that. We're at the Capitol, we eat it, we breathe it, and we can help you have a roadmap for those political issues that arise, that unless you're there at the Capitol and you're really seeing that big picture, you're not even going to know why your bill may have stalled out, because it's something for a political reason that we're going to help you navigate.
That's a good point. And term limits has not helped that. Chad?
Haley said it a little different way than I say it, but I say this on radio all the time. If you take the politics out of politics, it's not politics. You never take the politics out of politics, or it would be politics. She's absolutely right on the relationships. We already know, and like I said, I've been in members' offices before when I needed to talk to them, and I could tell by the way they walk in, their mood, they're looking to say no, they're looking for somebody to disagree with at that point in time. You don't know what meeting they just came out of or what's going on, but having those relationships, we know them well enough that we know this is not the time to approach them about this. And we have credibility with them because they do know us and they do have a relationship with us. So if we tell them something serious, they take it seriously. And so I think that helps. And something that Dino struck on, but I talk about this with communication all the time, especially if you're advocating. Everyone thinks of communication of what they're going to say, but listening is just as vital in communication. You have to hear what they're saying. When members are talking back to you or other lobbyists are talking back to you, you need to, if you're thinking of what you're going to say next, you're not paying attention to what they're feeding you in information. And when they're talking to you, listening is giving you more information. We say information is power. Well, you have to listen and not be thinking about what you're going to say next if you're really going to be communicating with somebody. And so as we talk about advocacy, I think it's very important that we say, it's not just about what you're going to say, but listen to the feedback of the legislators and listen to their questions and listen to their points of view to get a mindset for what they're thinking and where they are, because that's the only way you're going to civilly negotiate something out. And there's a lot of times when there's a problem with the bill, you just agree, look, we're going to pull this part out. Everybody's happy. That was the point of consternation, and you get 90% of what you want. And I mean, it's like I say, if I'm going to get 70% of what I want, unless that other 30% just would be disastrous, why wouldn't you take the win? I mean, you've got another session. And that's what I always say is, remember, there's always the next session. You can't burn a relationship with a legislature over one piece of legislation, because if you burn a relationship with the legislator over one piece of legislation, what happens next year when you need to go see them again? Or even that same session when you're going to have a different issue. You always have to remember, you have to live to fight another day. And no one's ever accomplished anything by yelling at anybody. You go yell at a legislator, they're going to vote against whatever you're doing at that point in time because you just yelled at them. It's just treating people like you would want to be treated. But I think the most important thing that I'd really like to emphasize about that on communication is it's not just what you're going to say, and don't be thinking of what you're going to say next when someone's talking to you. Take the information they're giving you because it's valuable, because then you have an insight to what they're thinking, and then you know how to answer their problems. Well
said. And Dino, I want to ask it in a little different take, rather than how can advocates benefit from having a lobbyist? How can advocates and advocacy groups benefit from partnering up with a company that has lobbyists like AT&T? Because I've seen some amazing things happen socially that are going on with AT&T over the last couple of years. What have you seen as far as working with advocacy organizations?
It's a great question, and I will just 2 words or less, I'll touch on what Chad and Haley, my good friends, the relationships are a big deal. And it's even more with the staff, with the House and Senate staff that write the language. When you talk about relationship, there's a lot of different levels there. Besides the legislator, that has a lot to do underneath that dome. And those of us that do this for a living every day underneath that dome have all those relationships built in. So that's an added benefit for that organization, that someone can go talk. You can talk to a House staffer that's written the bill, find out more information, so forth. A lot of different things on that. But knowledge is power. We know that. Coalitions are a big deal. And what you're talking about, this last question, Joe, is huge to AT&T. So when we partner with organizations on texting and driving, on seatbelts, and to modify that, to help OICA and those organizations with that, to help Ann Roberts is on here to listen what she's advocating for and working towards. All of these coalitions are vitally important to AT&T because our community is important to us. All those customers that we have in the state and other companies as well, your Verizons, your T-Mobiles, your US Sailors, your Cox, like all of those are great friends. Underneath the dome, this is a really good point, Joe, because underneath the dome, we are all very close friends and united as a coalition. Outside, those people can compete all they want, tooth and nail, and fight whatever they want to do. I'm not as concerned about that. I'm concerned about the laws, the regulations, and the statutes that are going to happen underneath this dome, that is going to affect an industry, which is positively or negatively going to affect customers, no matter what carrier you're with, if you're in this business. But besides our business, again, if it's an issue that's affecting children, social media, social injustice, the seatbelt, the texting and driving, those type of things. There's a bill that Senator Weaver's running where there was just real quickly, there was a young lady, was 9 years old, her father was a police officer, now he's a representative in Kansas, where she was abducted. They could have opened found the device. They had the device. So if they would have tracked that device, they could have potentially found this young girl. They didn't, and it was a horrific ending. But we've got to measure this year. 26 states have passed that legislation. So we will join with our name. We will join a large coalition to get that passed for the state of Oklahoma. So something like that doesn't happen. One of our children, something horrible happens. And this is something that it's right in the lap of OICA to help us get that through. We think that'll be fairly easy. But again, you get into issues with privacy and some things that people don't like. But when it comes to public safety in this regard, that's going to be a great measure that we'll join the coalition to help get through for Oklahoma.
Sounds good. We've got 2 questions over here. I want to ask them to one specific person each, and then I want to give you all an opportunity to close up and talk about some of the things y'all are working on in relation to kids. How much does the budget and appropriations play into lobbying and advocacy? Does it all come down to making sure passions remain funded? If so, what is the most effective way to influence those members in the budget committees, subcommittees, and the full committee? And Chad, you're muted.
Okay. Advocating for clients on appropriations is the same thing as advocating really with any member on policy bills. It's still about the relationships, supplying them with information. I mean, we obviously use handouts and hand them to members. And if you're going for an appropriation client, like I said, I represented OU for 15 years with higher ed. And, we would point out at that time, only 15% of OU's budget was coming from the state legislature. The rest was tuition and federal funding. And it had been just a decade earlier at about 30%. So, I mean, I would say, OU's only 15% away of not really being a state funded school because 85% of the money is coming from somewhere else. And higher ed is obviously a very important issue, just like the career tech system and the K through 12 system. People have to have options. Not everybody's going to be great at physics, but some people are great at physics, and we need engineers, and we need scientists, we need doctors. We have shortages in those fields. We talk about STEM and those type of things. So that's just an example of how when you're dealing with the appropriations process of members of the A&B committee, providing them with the details of this is what the funding was, this is what it is, and if it's cut, this is probably what we're looking at for tuition going up, just to give an example of, using higher ed. But the advocacy to those are just the same as it is when you're dealing with a legislature on a policy bill.
Very good
And I
answer.
want to say something about what Dino mentioned about texting. And please don't think I'm advocating for alcohol or marijuana while driving, but there was a police agency in Oklahoma that did a simulated test where they had people drive a course and they had them drink a drink of alcohol, use marijuana, and people were texting. It's a serious issue. The people that were texting and driving were horrible. They were the worst, because as the alcohol was added, then people that were drinking alcohol progressively got worse. And then people that used more marijuana got worse. But right off the bat, texting, they were all over the place, running over the cones. Now, how important that is to our kids. Now that everybody has a cell phone, they're 16 years old, they start driving. We're having more accidents because of texting and driving than alcohol and driving or drugs and driving. But it's not seen as a vice as much, because everybody texts, not everybody drinks, not everybody uses marijuana. But but someone has to point out the severity of the issue, and it is a serious danger to our children. I know of a teenager who died and passed away in a wreck while texting and driving. So it's a serious deal.
Thank you for adding that on. That I know that's something that we're going to try and tackle a little more this year, and there is a coalition working on some of that. Haley, Peyton has a question for you about our efforts through state and federal lobbying with Att Cares. Can you talk a little bit about?
Yeah, no, it's a great example of what we do as lobbyists working with organizations. And I mean, kudos to Joe and the team. Kudos to our partners at Youth Villages who are also extremely engaged on this. Happy to talk about it. It's a huge win. So we actually were approached during right at the beginning of COVID, whenever the first round of CARES came out, to join a coalition called Att Cares. It was a large national organization made up of many members from like foster club, youth villages, groups that work with youth transitioning out of foster care. And what we saw is when COVID hit, those kiddos were, I mean, not kiddos, they're youth. I shouldn't call them kiddos. Number one, they're adults, most of them. But that group of youth were really struggling. And Youth Voice was extremely strong. A lot of research was done going to that population, finding out what was happening with the COVID pandemic and how they were being impacted. And we saw that there's a real need there. And so we all came together. And OICA really helped with the grassroots in Oklahoma. I know a lot of you guys participated on calls. A lot of you guys contacted your congressman and asked for help, and that worked. Congressman Mullen actually authored a bill particularly about providing extra supports to youth transitioning out of foster care. Senator Langford got on the phone with many of us and learned about what we were seeing in the need.
I'm sorry, what?
Was she okay with us?
Oh.
Sorry. Senator Langford got on the phone with us and also heard about the needs. And we were so excited that in the end of the year spending bill, there were actually funds that were provided. They're going to help our youth who are transitioning out of foster care. The program's called Att Cares. The project was called Att Cares because that's the funding stream that the states receive for the youth that transition out of foster care. We are expecting around $7.8 million coming to the state of Oklahoma. That is double what we typically receive regularly, and it is going to be a huge win for our youth that are transitioning in that population. They're going to have the opportunity to even go back into care if they need those kinds of supports, which I think is going to be an interesting test and almost like a petri dish to see what expansion of foster care in Oklahoma could look like. And so we did win that fight. We got that money in the end of the year spending bill. And now we're actually doing some executive lobbying with the Department of Human Services to make sure that those supports go directly to those youth. So huge win, huge efforts. I know we don't always hear the good stories. We hear a lot about the bad things happening in Congress especially, but kudos to everybody involved. We got a huge win in Congress, and it's going to impact kids here in the state. So stay involved in OICA. We'll be providing a lot of reports on how things happen, and we're staying engaged right to the end and can't wait to eventually get to share some personal stories about youth who were impacted here in Oklahoma and were helped with these funds.
Good deal. And we're coming up right on the time, but I want to allow some time for each of you to talk about an issue that y'all have at the Capitol that would relate to kids. Chad, you want to kick us off?
Well, like every good husband or smart husband, I do whatever my wife tells me, and she sits on the board of Pepper's Ranch. And so anything that dealing with foster care that they get involved with. And I want to say this, we talk about legislators are just people too. Lobbyists, we're just people too. I'm still a father. I'm still a husband. And I would say every session, there are 3 to 4 bills that I end up lobbying for pro bono without being asked to. I mean, Joe, you asked me to help with a bill for the Child Advocacy group. I help with the bill, but I see legislation and I see how it affects my kids and everybody else's kids in the community. And I think there are a lot of lobbyists like that we don't talk about it to people or we don't make a big deal about it, but we'll hop on a bill just because we want to see it passed. And it's good policy and it affects our children, whether it's education or like I brought up texting and driving. I mean, things that are very dangerous. I'm a dad. I think about that. I've got kids that are driving. And so, those are, I pretty much will do whatever you and my wife tell me to do when it comes to kids.
Stephanie's amazing. So I trust her judgment.
And Dino, I'm not going to give you a choice. Can you talk about your broadband work?
Yeah, I'll try just to take a 90 seconds or so, but broadband is a big issue in the state of Oklahoma. We all know that. The speaker has shared in his address to the House that it was one of his top priorities. We passed a measure last year that created the broadband or Oklahoma Rural Broadband Expansion Council. This council was put in place to bring ideas to the legislature on how to increase and when we say broadband, some people just want to use internet. It's the same thing. So how we get more people access to the World Wide Web. There's just a plethora of different information. And at some point later, Joe, you want to hand me back and go through a lot more detail? I certainly can. I think the industry would come back and say that, and there's a lot of people in Oklahoma playing in the broadband field. You have the electric co-ops, 30 something in the state. 6 of those are providing broadband today, receiving federal funds to do that, which is great. They're putting it in places where they may not have services today. And we're talking about this. There's 3 different types of broadband. And I'll try to put this in a over 30,000 foot view, Joe. But this council is looking at a fixed connection, a hard connection that you plug in, you get access to the internet. There are other ways to achieve that: a fixed wireless or a hotspot, if you will, a box that runs on wireless that doesn't have a connection to electricity, but it doesn't have a fixed connection to it. Then you have just your wireless option. You might be surprised if we looked at, and we have companies that are looking at data in Oklahoma now, mapping data to show where broadband is available and where it's not. That is just looking at a fixed connection. We have a lot of families that have a wireless connection. So you would say they are served. They may not have the fastest connection, but they have connection. I will add that when the pandemic started, the Secretary Hoffmeister asked every teacher 2 questions: do you have internet access, and do you have a device to get onto the internet? So we have that data for the state. You would be surprised at some of the numbers you would see. Keith talked about education and the teachers being raised. I've got a young 1st grade teacher, my daughter in Edmond. I wish she would get a raise, but in that class in Northeast Edmond, there was 7 kids out of 18 that did not have internet access. And given the demographics of around the state, you might be somewhat surprised at that. So every company that provides internet has a low income product, most of them for $10 a month to get access. But this broadband issue is a big, big deal. And we are on this council, we are looking to see how we can increase adoption is a major factor. And you might be surprised some data that you would look at to show that how many families don't have internet access, a number of different reasons. It may be cost, it may be digital literacy, privacy. They think Big Brother's watching them. A lot of different reasons they don't have a device to get onto the internet. So a lot of different reasons to do that. Keep in mind, I'll just add with this, that in Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma is 5th in the nation at taxing the equipment to build broadband. So if you move that to manufacturing, if you bring, Elon Tusk brings, a manufacturing plant, all that equipment, every bit of that is sales tax free. But on the broadband side, the company's irrelevant. You pay 9% on the equipment to build broadband. So we're looking at ways in which to, and Joe, one of your friends, Dr. Brian Whitaker, a great professor at OSU, is helping this council to drive how can we increase not only adoption in Oklahoma and a number of different ways how we can do that. And more importantly, to get back to your original point, how do we help the children of the state have access to for their classes, for the virtual meetings and so forth. I gave that a 30,000 foot view, but again, at some point in time, we want to get that, talk about that with your group. I'll be glad to come back.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Doing great, thank you.
Good.
And Haley, do you want to wrap us up?
I'm getting cracked up about the, sorry.
Do you have anything you wanted to add on, Haley?
Absolutely. I'm going to try to be short, but this is going to end with there are some things that everybody can do to help us this session. I'm going to highlight 3 bills. Our policy committee has not met just yet to go through and prioritize everything else we're working on, but I know these 3 are for sure going to be OICA priorities. Our amazing policy director at OICA is going to help me out. She's going to put the bill numbers in the chat because I don't have all of those actually memorized. And you guys probably see me on my computer. I'm talking to Peyton, the policy director at OICA during this because she's so helpful. But these are 3 bills I want everybody to support. It's going to be critical that we get out there and get them passed this year. The first bill is, I believe, House Bill 1709. It's like the only bill I've got memorized so far, bill number. It's by Representative Brian Hill. And what it does, it's actually coming, we tried to do this last year. COVID derailed it because we didn't have enough time. But in the state of Oklahoma, you have to be in an out-of-home placement at the age of 18 whenever you age out in foster care in Oklahoma to qualify for our transitional youth services. We are going to work to drop that age to 16. We all know that if these youth have been in the system that long and these families are struggling, they need help to make sure that we're making these youth have the supports in place to be able to transition into adulthood. So House Bill 1709, please contact your legislators and support Representative Brian Hill on that. The next one, Peyton's going to give you guys the number. It's by a new senator that we're really excited to work with this year, Senator Jessica Garvin. Shout out to her. We're going to tackle an issue that Oklahoma is the only state in our region that does not put a minimum age on youth to be adjudicated into our juvenile justice system. We feel very passionately that if a youth is younger, their brain is not even developed yet, they do not have the competency to participate in their own trial, in their own juvenile justice system, we are going to actually cap the age that youth can be adjudicated into our juvenile justice system. So Peyton's going to give you the bill number on that so you can see more details on that one. And the other one, shout out to Representative Sherry Conley. I know that she was participating in the Learning Lab last year, and she is pushing to make sure that our schools have MTSS, our multi-tiered systems of support. We've got to make sure that in a state that has some of the highest ACE scores in the nation, and we have the behavioral issues that we have with our youth, that our teachers are equipped to deal with the behavioral issues in the classroom. And the research is there. It's evidence-based. MTSS is an amazing program. And we want to do everything we can to support Representative Sherry Conley for her support of children and teachers in the state of Oklahoma. So that's my ask of you guys. I love a good action item at the end of any type of discussion we have on how advocates can be active in the state legislature. So get on the phones, get on the computers, get in touch with your legislators, take them to coffee, talk to them about how important kids are in the community, and talk to them about those 3 bills.
Well, thank you both very much. This was fantastic information, and I think provided a clearer picture about what lobbyists are. And it goes well beyond the old days of just waiting in the lobby of the hotel at the U.S. Capitol building for the legislators to come back from work. You all provided a great look into the work, and appreciate each of you for the work that you do. And we are running over, so unless you need a break, we're going to have to just go ahead and skip the break and move on. We have a next presenter who is a wonderful presenter. And Lacey, if you just put up the graphic, I want to be sure we thank our sponsors quickly. Each of these sponsors made this possible. I want to thank Journal Record, Cherokee Nation, Sac and Fox Nation, Southwest Ledger, Law Office of Mike Green, Stanley, the Honorable Corey Williams, Dr. Dwight Sublett, the Kaliki family, and George Crumey for their sponsorships to make this happen. As we go into this next segment, we have the opportunity to hear from somebody who is an expert in redistricting, has worked in this for 10 years through the last census work for the House of Representatives, and now is the top staff member over in the state Senate, who is still working on making sure that this is done right. I want to turn this over to Arnella Kargas, talk about legislative redistricting and some of the aspects of what you hear, and also some of the ways that advocates can get involved. Arnella?
Thank you, Joe. Can you hear me?
Barely.
I can turn my microphone up. Is that better?
Just a hair better.
A hair. I don't know if I get closer if that will help. So as Joe said, my name is Arnella Kargas. I am the Chief Operating Officer at the Oklahoma State Senate. 10 years ago, I was working for the Oklahoma House of Representatives, and at that time, I was the redistricting director for redistricting in the House. So as Joe mentioned, redistricting is a project that the legislature is tasked with this year. We are required by the Oklahoma Constitution to redraw legislative lines as well as the congressional lines following every 10-year census. The House and the Senate work independently to draw their individual districts. So the House will work on a 101 House district map, and the Senate will work on the 48 Senator district map. Why do we have to do this? Well, the reason is to adhere to the constitutional standard of one person, one vote. So to make sure that no one person's vote might be, in lack of better terminology, worth more than someone else's vote in another part of the state, we redistrict to make sure districts are as equal in population as possible. And the census data is what helps us make sure, to the best extent possible, that districts are as equal as we can make them be. Congressional districts, the legal standard on that is one person difference. So if the 2020 census data tells us we have an odd number of people, we might have one congressional district that has one more person than the other four, but that's why that standard of one person, one vote is just that important, that among congressional districts, the federal standards are just that strict. So you'll hear a couple terms probably in the news even right now: reapportionment and redistricting. So reapportionment is what occurs in Congress when they determine what states get however many congressional seats. So you've probably heard that a couple states are set to lose congressional seats and some states are set to gain seats. So that is the difference between reapportionment and redistricting. Redistricting is the act that the legislature is going to do in terms of literally redrawing our legislative and congressional lines. On the next slide, you can see this is a prediction based upon 2019 estimate data from the census, because the actual 2020 census data and apportionment information has not been released. So once that information changes, this map could change. You can see Oklahoma remains the same with 5 congressional seats. For Oklahoma to have gained a 6th congressional seat, which we used to have, what, now 20 years ago, we would have needed 175,000 plus more residents. Of course, that would have to counter that no other states would have gained any other more population. We would have needed nearly 200,000 more people for us to gain a congressional seat.
That's okay.
Redistricting terminology. So again, as we're talking about redistricting this year, in case you hear these terms, census block, that is the tiniest geography of census data that we receive. So census blocks are very small pieces of geography. Census block groups are just that, groups of census blocks. Census tracts are then the next highest geographical level, and census tracts to some extent in redistricting data might follow your precinct lines, but there is no real intention for that. That just has kind of been a trend in recent decades in redistricting. Then census place is kind of the next largest, and then county, we all know what counties are, that's the next largest. Citizen voting age population. So citizen voting age population, the redistricting data tells us if people are 18 or older. So when we are, I'll get into some issues about making sure we have majority minority districts for various racial and ethnic groups. The citizen voting age population is important to know that you have enough people 18 years or older to be able to elect someone to office. So whereas the census counts everybody from 0 to 100, however many years of age, the voting age is important when you're talking about the ability to elect certain populations. On the next slide, you can see the current congressional map. 10 years ago, the changes were really just a little bit in Canadian County and a little bit in Rogers County, maybe some in Creek, if I remember correctly. But from the 20-year-old map to this map that was drawn 10 years ago, not a lot of change. I will say, and you'll be able to see this with some of the population data I'll share, the way the urban centers have grown, and or people moving out of rural Oklahoma, the areas surrounding Oklahoma and Tulsa County could really change a lot on the congressional map as well as the legislative maps. On the next slide, you can see the current House districts. To some extent, you can see where there's a cluster around Oklahoma County and Tulsa County, because 10 years ago, we needed House districts to be approximately 37,000 people each. You look at House District 61, that took that amount of space to get 37,000 people 10 years ago. I think that's, knowing how the population loss has been in that part of the state, that will change again. So you think about House District 61 pushing on its neighbors because it's growing in size, then that's a domino effect across the rest of the state. Next on, you can see for redistricting for 2021, this is the State House of Representatives information, who their lead chairpersons are, and ways to contact them. So the House and Senate offices are continuing to take public input on the redistricting process. Of course, really the very best way for you to share your thoughts about redistricting is through your legislator. Redistricting is like any other bill that goes to the legislature. You have an elected state representative, you have an elected state senator for your district. They represent you in that manner, and it'll be a bill that goes through the committee and floor process and switch houses like any other piece of legislation in the process you've heard about this week. The next slide shows you the Senate maps. So whereas there's 101 House districts and 48 Senate districts, the Senate districts have to cover almost twice as many people. So you can see how much larger those districts get. So again, if you think about Northwest Oklahoma, not to pick on them, but they have lost population, Senate District 27 is going to grow in size. Senate District 26 also needs to grow in size, just due loss of population in those areas. So you start taking those big chunks, they get bigger, that starts pushing those lines in different directions. So when things really change in the state, it's really because population dictates redistricting. Next is the Senate contact info. You can see who the Senate chairs and vice chairs are. Both the House and Senate have bipartisan leadership on their committees. And again, for the Senate, contact information if you have any public input you want to share about your area. Next, probably more important, are redistricting principles. So these principles are something the House has adopted over the last few decades, at least since the 90s, per records I was able to find 10 years ago even. The Senate actually has redistricting outlined in the Oklahoma Constitution. The House does not, due to a court case many years ago that basically took the House direction out of the Oklahoma Constitution. So as I mentioned, the top redistricting principle is equal population. So districts should be as equal as possible. The next few are not so much in order of importance, but are most generally used. So compactness, the kind of best square or circle a district could be is the most compact district. You saw some of those districts that stretch across the state. That is not very compact. And in fact, the redistricting software that we've used in the past and we'll use again this time can actually give you a score as to how compact or not a district is. Contiguous. So a district has to be touching at all points. You can't have a district be half in one place and half in another. They have to be connected at some point with the rest of the district. Preservation of political subdivisions. So counties, keeping counties whole is a good redistricting principle. Keeping towns and cities whole to the best that you can is a good redistricting principle. School districts, those types of political subdivisions where you can. Now I've heard people complain about how, well, I live on one side of the street and then the other side of the street, somebody else is the representative. Well, at some point a line has to go somewhere. So that's why nothing is going to be perfect, because at some point you have to draw the line and make things as equal in population as possible. So that's where the redistricting principles begin to compete against each other. Next is communities of interest. So keeping communities of interest together are important. In the Oklahoma City metro area, we might think about communities like the Plaza District or the Paseo District or Capitol Hill area. In rural Oklahoma, there are places like Wayne and Payne, Oklahoma. Now, I-35 is a nice redistricting line maybe to use, but that divides the communities of Wayne and Payne, who are accustomed to being part of a community together, even though they're split by I-35. So those communities of interest can be all kinds of different things, but communities of interest also mean different things to different people. So I'm sure if I asked our group today, what is important to you in a community of interest, I would get probably 70 different answers, because it's different it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. Next on redistricting principles, preservation of cores of prior districts. So the idea with this is you don't want to upset the entire map. We don't wipe the map clean and start over. Those cores of prior districts are also a community of interest. Joe Dorman, having served in the House, knows even though his district has changed over time, there's a core of it that has always remained the same. And so preserving those cores of districts also helps with that principle of communities of interest. Next, very important in the legal sense, is compliance with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. This means that you cannot draw a legislative or congressional district to intentionally exclude minority candidates from the ability to get elected to office. And this is where we take in the factor of a citizen voting age population to make sure that there are enough, not only just an equal amount of people, but enough people that could actually elect a candidate of their choice to office. So that's an important redistricting principle for all states. So here's a little summary of kind of what we talked about. And this list of all those things I mentioned are actually listed in the Oklahoma Constitution, that the Senate is required to adhere to those redistricting principles. So when drawing actually starts, you have to deal with the population, but then as you start moving the lines, you keep those redistricting principles in mind. And the rub comes when you begin to have those redistricting principles compete with each other. At some point, decisions have to be made and lines have to go somewhere. And so there's a give and take in those principles. Next, you can see where we are headed with Oklahoma's population. as we await the official 2020 census data. Oklahoma grew by not quite as much as we had the previous 10 years, but House districts will need to grow in size due to we have an increase in population, just not as much as other states. So House, Senate, and congressional districts all have to grow in size. So if you take that population into account and think about how I mentioned the corners of the state, we've lost population in those areas, and all of those, like you just take the four corners and those districts grow in size. Now that's where the push starts coming, pushing lines and maybe pushing legislators into different parts of representing different parts of the state. Next on here, I have, since I work for the Senate, what the Senate leader, President Pro Tempore Greg Treat, has said his plan for the process is to conduct the 2021 redistricting process in a thorough, bipartisan, and professional manner. And if you look at the composition of the committee, I think you can see that they do want to make this a bipartisan effort throughout the process. Next is actually the House map in terms of their regions. They've divided up to kind of handle their redistricting by regions to start, which is something similar to what we did 10 years ago. You kind of start with those regions, but then the reality is, as regions draw their maps, you put those pieces together, things are going to change again. The dots on there actually represent where the Senate and the House have held town hall meetings across the state. And you'll see here on our schedule next that the last town hall is actually tonight. It says Tulsa, but it's actually located in Owasso. For some reason you're in that area and you want to attend that meeting, the information is on the OK Senate homepage. There's a redistricting slider there. You can click on that and get details. The House has completed with their town halls. And in fact, this past Monday evening, the House and Senate together held their last virtual town hall, which the last one we actually had about maybe not as many participants as you all have today, but quite a few participants and quite a few questions as people are trying to educate themselves about this process across the state. The House and Senate also plan to take public map submissions. So I think in these first couple weeks of the legislature, the House and Senate committees separately will adopt their guidelines for what they will need from the public if you're planning to submit a map. Some of the things are, we need a whole map. We have to draw a map of 48 districts. If you're going to submit a map, just sending me one Senate district doesn't help, because that doesn't help me fix the rest of the state. Additionally, we'll have to conform to the guidelines we're going to subject ourselves to. So when the Senate adopts guidelines, we will get specific about population deviation and some of those principles I talked about in the Senate guidelines. If we're asking the public to submit a map, you're going to have to follow the same rules that the legislature follows. Next is a timeline. So we're basically most of the way through this. The change on this, I think you can actually see on the next slide. With the process, we've already begun kind of training and education of legislators. And again, with the public, with the statewide public meetings, we started back in November and going through the end of this month. The deadline for redistricting data to the states, there is April 1 through July 31. Now, due to a lot of compounding reasons, the census data is delayed. Typically, by December 31st, the Census Bureau would have already had to deliver the apportionment data to Congress, so Congress could assign the appropriate number of congressional seats to the 50 states. This is going to be delayed, and the apportionment data right now, the latest from the Census Bureau as of yesterday, is Congress will not receive that apportionment data until the end of April. And then at this point, they have not really given a deadline on when the states will receive the redistricting data that we need to draw those districts that are equal in population as possible. So we are just kind of in a waiting game as we await that official census data. So there is a deadline in the Oklahoma Constitution that redistricting has to be completed within 90 days from the beginning of session. Now, the way our sine die calendar falls, sine die actually comes before that time period lapses. So it will be interesting to see how we figure this out if we get census data very, very late. I want to say 10 years ago, we got redistricting data maybe late February, early March. 20 years ago, we probably got it early to mid-March. So the fact we are going into the legislative session where we need to redistrict, don't know the date we're going to receive that census data, will be an interesting exercise for us all to go through. In a quick summary, as kind of all those principles, and besides the principles, there's also, an entire book of case law that dictates redistricting decisions as well. So anybody, Oklahoma or any other state, does not risk a lawsuit. So various legal cases you have to keep in mind when you're going about the task of redistricting. So it's a big task in front of us, but thankfully we have legislators that have been working and studying this issue for many months. And thankfully, I think even more so than 10 years ago, the public has been even more engaged. So I think it stands to be a good process. Now we just wait on the Census Bureau.
That was fantastic, Ornella. Thank you. We do have one question from Claudia. How do citizens work to assure gerrymandering does not occur, and what transparencies are in place?
So I know the term gerrymandering, has some poor connotations. Sometimes people see a map that has funny lines. That does not necessarily mean a gerrymander has occurred. Gerrymandering has different legal tests based on a lot of that case law that I mentioned. Really, what you have to do is take the map and ask questions to say, have you followed, you as the Oklahoma Senate, you as the Oklahoma Legislature have said these principles are important. Where did you follow them and where did you not follow them? And why did you not follow them? So at some point, if we split a county, well, what was the reason? We got enough population, and so we stopped at that line. So even though a district looks funny, does not mean a gerrymander has occurred. In fact, some of the oddest looking districts have been drawn that way over many decades in Oklahoma because we're trying to protect a historical majority minority district to make sure a minority population in Oklahoma has the ability to elect a candidate that looks like them. So House District 99 is one of the historical African-American majority minority districts. 10 years ago, I think South Oklahoma City was on the cusp of having a Hispanic majority minority district, but the population was not quite there. But that's where the detailed 2020 census data is important to help us identify if some new and different majority minority districts are possible. I see another question, Joe.
Yeah, and I think you touched on some of it, but I don't know if you can read the questions. We have one about how the historical precedent core districts play into redistricting.
So, part of it is natural. So if you start in the four corners of the state, that's a little bit natural. And then you start moving around. Now, by the time you get to the metro areas, yes, this just happened over the last few decades where Oklahoma continues to lose population in our rural parts of the state. So you'll see the rural districts change quite a bit. You're easy to see when you're overlaying those maps over the last few decades. But then you get to the urban areas, there's some cores there that won't change to the extent that, a Panhandle district or Broken Bow district would change. As I mentioned, House District 99 is an example where, though it's kind of center of Oklahoma City, it almost follows, Highway 77 in the middle of Oklahoma City. And then its neighboring districts, like there has historically been what is basically a Nichols Hills House District. So those are kind of the cores that I talk about. Well, even though around the edges they might change, that district still exists. Though with population change, some of them do go away. So 10 years ago in the House, Elk City used to have a House district basically to itself, all to itself. Just due to the loss of population, Elk City got divided in two. And I will tell you, constituents from that area were pretty unhappy that they felt like they were losing their state representative. For one, they were losing their state representative at the time because he was term limited with our 12-year term limits. Same thing, there was a district in southeastern Oklahoma that at the time was Representative Paul Roan, who is a Democrat. He was actually, even though Republicans were in the majority in the House 10 years ago, he was chair of that regional subcommittee for that part of the state. But his district actually became what is now, I think, Sherry Conley's House district, kind of sandwiched between Norman and McLean County. So just to the sheer loss of population in southeastern Oklahoma, that district moved to central Oklahoma. So it's a good principle. At some point, when the population isn't there for you, that's where the competition and those principles comes into play.
And because of time, I'm going to ask one question. I know the answer, but I think it's something on the minds of a lot of people. There was an effort to modify the census count as far as excluding people who are not considered U.S. citizens. Constitution is clear, you count everybody, whether they're a citizen or not. Is there any possibility that the states could go through and modify the census count by excluding people?
For Oklahoma, I don't even know how we begin to gather that data. The Census Bureau data that is going to be released will not include any citizen immigration information whatsoever. It'll just be, age, race, gender, the very basics. So that citizenship information that was discussed will not be shared with the states as part of the public law data that is required to be sent to the states. And in Oklahoma, same thing. We've had similar questions about prison populations and how we could, count those people rather than where they're counted in the census, the location of the prison, how we would count them back home. Oklahoma's data and information about those prisoners just is not where we need it to be to attempt to do anything different today.
As a former lawmaker who bordered a prison and had a military installation, don't touch those places.
We've heard that before, yes.
And I just wanted to say that jokingly, as lawmakers are very, very concerned about this, because my district grew in size. It doubled in land mass in the last redistricting. And it was just shifting around a little bit. I lost half of the population at Fort Sill, and that made me take on an entire new county. And Don Arms and I did some horse trading on that to bring in more of the population. And Corey Holland and he took in more Marlow and I took in more of Rush Springs. So we made some of those population areas better as far as representing those communities. But certainly I lost a lot of gas money having to drive around to a much larger district as a rural lawmaker. But that's just part of what we're going to see in this next one, I believe.
And I think some of those areas you mentioned are the same ones that, because they sit on those district lines today, just due to population shifts, are likely to see change again.
Good deal. I know, Arnell, you put contact information in the slideshow, and we will share the slideshow. If you want to type in the contact information for folks, so who they can contact as far as questions about redistricting, I'd certainly encourage you, if you're in the Owasso area and you're comfortable going, go to that one tonight and certainly pay attention. We will keep people updated as well. Yes. And I know how busy you are right now. Thank you so much for taking time to come visit with us today about this very important issue.
Certainly. And I've been happy to listen in. You have a very good presentations this week. So thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least for the day, I jokingly call my spirit animal because she certainly has helped guide me, because she's been through the ropes of working in child advocacy at OICA for more than 20 years, and then continued to work in children's health issues, and is still an advocate to this day. It's my pleasure to introduce Ann Roberts to speak about how to do your research, how to be prepared on these issues as they come up, so you will know about what's happening at the Capitol in the areas of interest for you. So Ann, I want to turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate that. Hi, everybody. Since we're running short on time, and I know I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch, I'm going to kind of brief my remarks up and not go as in depth as I had planned. But you've had some fabulous presentations yesterday and today, and I think one of the threads that you've heard is one of the keys to being a good advocate and to getting engaged at the Capitol is to know who your own representative and senator are. So if you remember nothing else that I say today, remember that. They really are your key, even though they may be of a different party. They may have lots of different opinions than you do. you are still their constituents and they still need to hear from you. So please continue to build that relationship, and that will see you through a lot. So Joe has asked me to talk about how to research bills and track bills, how to follow agendas. And there's really two basic ways. One of them is to hook up with another organization to let them do all the work for you. And the second one is to do it yourself. So I am a big proponent in the first option, in hooking up with other organizations. Obviously, if you are a kid person, you'd hook up with OICA or OCCY, and they will be your ticket to helping you manage through the session. Because most organizations like OICA that have a lobbyist at the state capitol, they will be doing weekly reports, probably have a newsletter. Certainly you can sign up on their websites to help you kind of keep track of where the bills are and all of that. So the best way to do it is to hook up with somebody. Now I'm going to see if I can share my screen. I'm not sure who is in charge of all of that. Is that a letting? Ah, very good. So I just wanted to throw this up here because I'm a very visual learner. And it's helpful for me if I can see what's going on. I call this my Monopoly board. And the object of the goal is to get through all the boxes before time runs out. But I just wanted to stress all the stuff that Joe talked about yesterday about how a bill goes through the process. One of the obstacles to following for a layperson, and I mean a layperson, like Haley said, lobbyists eat and breathe this stuff. But if that's not you, a nice, quick and dirty way to help you through that is to notice the various obstacles, I'm going to call them, or just a path that a bill goes through to become law. And I'm going to show you here that, like in this first box here that says committee work, that's one of the points of intervention for child advocates or any advocates, is to get involved with the committee work. But again, Joe knows all of this, Haley knows all of this. So if you hook up with them, you can just let them keep up with all of this stuff for you. But really, legislation is or the legislative process is kind of like a semester at school, where for the first several weeks you do one thing and then you take a test. If you pass that test, you go on to the next box. If you pass that text, you go on to the next one. And so in each of these points, lots of bills will die. And so if you're not paying attention and if you're not getting involved, the bills that you care about could go by the wayside. Because there's really, even though everything at the state capitol is transparent, meaning everything is online, all the bills are online, you can view every committee hearing, every floor action is online, but I think there's some obstacles that keep the general public from really understanding how all this works. One of them, I think Dino or Chad mentioned, is the pace. Things happen so quickly. And then you can see here from the chart that in that first 4-week period, all the bills have to go through a committee. Well, my goodness, there's like 3,000 bills introduced every year, and they all have to be heard in the first 4 weeks. Well, you do the math. It's really not even possible. And so this is the first obstacle to getting things through. Mostly it's the volume of stuff. And I think yesterday you heard somebody talk about the fact that even though we have 3,000 bills that are introduced, by the end of session, you might have 350 or 400 bills that actually make it to the governor's desk. So that's a good lesson. If you're not paying attention and if you're not engaged, your bill could just die because nobody's paying attention. Nobody's caring about it. The second thing is the language that the legislature uses can be kind of off-putting. So if you don't know the language, you don't really understand, like, what does engrossed mean? What is a committee substitute? And so again, if you're hooking up with Joe or with someone who is an organizational person who has a website or a newsletter that you can keep up with, you can tell, my bill is going to be heard in the committee, Or once those first 4 weeks are up, it goes to the floor. And here's an opportunity for you to intervene. The nice thing about hooking up with an organization, not only do they keep track of stuff, but they provide resources for you. And by that, I mean, they let you know, oh, your bill is going to be heard in committee tomorrow. Here's a fact sheet, or here's some additional information. Here's some research that we've done for you. So as an advocate, hooking up with an organization makes it so much easier because you don't have to do all the work yourself. All right. So in addition to hooking up with an organization, Joe and Annette at the Oklahoma Commission on Children and Youth, they do the broad stroke stuff, but there are also organizations that deal with what you might consider a subset of the child population. So that if you are interested in, say, children with disabilities, children with diabetes, children who have experienced trauma, children in the foster care system, there are organizations that deal specifically with that. So in addition to hooking up with OICA, you might want to Google those, the topic that you're interested in and just look at all of that, right? So the other thing is, if you are looking at legislation, say you open the paper one day and you see somebody is authoring a piece of legislation that piques your interest. One of the best ways to find out more information about that bill first is to call your own senator or representative and ask if they would introduce you to the person who is sponsoring that bill. Or barring that, if they're not available, just directly call that representative or senator and chat with them to find out who requested the bill. Is there an organization? Was there a task force? Do you have some extra information that I could learn more about this? And frankly, I mean, you heard Chad say, even though he has a paid gig, I mean, he's contracted with a lot of different organizations, he's still a dad. He's still concerned about other pieces of legislation that are going to impact kids. So sometimes it's a matter of, hooking up with people who share your same concerns and your same interests. So if indeed, you are hooked up to Joe or Annette or someone to help you understand all of this stuff, another way is if you are working with a coalition of groups, and I think this was mentioned before, because say you are on a coalition about seatbelts. Let's use Dino's example. Well, all of the people on the coalition might not have resources. They might not be hooked up with an organization, but if Dino is on your coalition, you might be able to ask him to help you follow bills that will help you understand the process, right? Okay, so now I'm going to kind of turn a corner and say, if indeed you want to do it yourself, which again, I'm going to recommend that the first option is to work with a coalition, work with an organization, let them do all the work for you. But if those of you who are really interested in this and kind of want to dig a little deeper, I'm going to share my screen again. I hope, maybe. No? Let's see. Well, that didn't work.
And you're already sharing the screen.
Right.
So you may have to unshare it.
All right. New share. Oh, here we go. All right. Well, it's not going to work. Well, what I was going to share was the way to look up something online. Let me see if I can do that real quick. Nope, that's not working. So what I was going to share with you is, again, everything at the Capitol is open and free to you, but it's kind of dicey and kind of challenging for a lay person to figure it out, because I think they presuppose that you know some stuff. But if you go to oklegislature.gov that is the website for you to help you follow legislation. And you start out, there's a program, it's a public tracking program called LENS, L-E-N-S. And you can click on that and create your own account. And then it has a little box for you, if you know the bill number, to go ahead and put the bill number in and you can track it. Well, the problem is, how do you know what bill numbers to track? So if you start with the oklegislature.gov, and at the top, you can look at legislation and it'll say text of measures. You click on that and it will bring up all the legislation that's going to be considered this year. You scroll, you can read through and find the ones that interest you. And the one that I was going to demonstrate today, if I could figure out how to share my screen. Nope. It's just not working for me. You could, I picked Senate Bill 89 because that is creating a mandate for health education in schools. This is a thing that we as child advocates have been advocating for many years. And so then you would know what the bill number is. It's Senate Bill 89. Then you can go back to the LENS system, the LENS system, and enter in Senate Bill 89. Click on enter, and there you go. You can track how that bill is going through the process. And then the other thing that you can do is, again, call the author of the bill, introduce yourself and just have a chat, or just visit with the executive assistant or the legislative assistant of that particular legislator and say, I'm interested in this bill. Can you put me on the list for notification when the bill is going to be heard, so that you will be notified if the bill is going to be up in a committee. Now, as an advocate and as a teacher, I have a class at OCU that I teach this in. I encourage people to go ahead and view a committee hearing in the committee where your bill is going to be heard. And then you can watch the dynamics that occur between the members in the committee. It's kind of interesting. Each committee has sort of a personality, and depending on its chair. And you can kind of see, they're very collegial, they work well together, they're very informal. In fact, a lot of times when I was still at the Capitol all day, every day, sitting in those committee meetings, if they were very informal, you might have a committee chair say, hey, Ann, what do you think about this? Out of the blue, and I would stand up and share what I thought. Other committees are incredibly formal. They call each other by their titles. They don't allow public comment. And so it's always helpful as an advocate to go ahead and go online and view a committee hearing to see what the dynamics are in your committee hearing before you go, right? So without me being able to share my screen, I want to open it up for questions real quick and see if Joe has anything. He always wants me to tell stories. So Joe, if you want me to tell any stories, let me know.
Well, I want to say one of the amazing accomplishments that you had, amongst many, was working with the Fit Kids Coalition and the work that y'all got to do, working with collaborative partners. How did you keep the collaborative partners organized and focused on that goal with getting through those bills with the Fit Kids Coalition?
Great question. Well, the Fit Kids Coalition actually started at Integris Health with Stan Hupfeld, and this was probably in the early 2000s when his pediatricians would come to him and say, we are seeing kids with type 2 diabetes. And this used to be considered an adult onset disease. So we're just shocked. We didn't get schooled in that when we were in med school. So help us figure out how to do this. So he came to me as the CEO of OICA and said, could you help us? Well, sure. And so we hooked up with the CDC because they had already done all the research on how do we tackle childhood obesity. This is a huge issue. And they sort of had a 5-point plan that included everything from getting vending machines out of schools, lessening screen time, changing what's in the school cafeterias, getting more physical education in schools and health education in schools. And so we were able to tackle each of those issues one by one. And frankly, we had to count on a lot of members of the coalition. Now, one of the interesting things is, this is really critical for you to understand, that even though we're all child advocates, and I think Haley said, nobody wakes up in the mornings thinking, well, I'm gonna go hurt kids today. No, but they have different priorities. They have a budget, they have, constituents to answer to. And so when we were trying to get the vending machines out of schools, I was not aware, as the superintendents were, that a lot of their budgets rely on people who have get their profits from the vending machines. So you had your Pepsis and your Coca-Colas and everything that would donate gobs of money to the school districts for the opportunity to put a vending machine in their school. And it was not a little teeny piece of money, it was a lot of money that paid for scoreboards and equipment and all this kind of stuff. So we had to change our tactics. Instead of trying to eliminate vending machines, we changed what's in them. Because come to find out, Frito-Lay doesn't just, or PepsiCo doesn't just manufacture Pepsi, they also do raisins and wheat crackers and things that are a little healthier. So we were able to simply switch what's in them rather than completely eliminating them. So that really required that we work with those superintendents to keep everybody happy. So don't be afraid to just ask questions. You can't just say, this is what we're going to do, then you're going to butt heads with all the superintendents. But you're really working toward the same goal if you can just figure out how to get there, right?
I appreciate that story, because that also demonstrates that you have to have some compromise and you have to have those coalitions work. And one of the things that we haven't discussed is a lot of times organizations will sit down and negotiate ideas and then take them to the lawmaker who's carrying the bill and say, we've worked out the problems. And lawmakers love that because it saves them work.
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm trying to think of the subject matter of the bill. It had something to do, when I was working at Integris Health, I was working on a bill that was going to change something about mental health and having, it was, the current system says that if you come into the emergency room, only the physician in charge can, in the middle of the night, somebody will come into the emergency room high as a kite, and you got to restrain them. Well, only physicians can order restraints. But as you know, it always happens in the middle of the night. And sometimes, a lot of people don't know this. Not all hospitals have a doctor on site 24/7. A lot of these small, you'll know this, Joe, a lot of small rural hospitals, they're on call, but they're usually asleep. And so we wanted to change the state law to allow the person in charge that night, usually it was a nurse or a PA. And so we put the bill out there, but I had to get buy-in from the physicians groups, the nurses groups, and the substance abuse prevention people, And so I had to go and get okay and get the language okay by all three of those groups before I gave it to the legislature. So in other words, don't wait until the first day of session and put your bill out there, because all the other groups know to do is try to kill your bill. Try to work out the differences before you get there. You'll have a much better chance, and then you'll have people on board that'll help you get it done.
Well, it's a golden opportunity to ask Ann questions for anyone that has. Please type them in the chat section. We may have answered all the questions and partially overwhelmed people today.
I want to tell you one more story before I leave, and Joe loves this one. Years ago, we were working on the prevention of youth access to tobacco. Now, And I'm looking at the faces here. A lot of you are very young. And so you'll think, well, we've always not been able to smoke in restaurants. Well, no, no, no. This has been a long, hard rule trying to keep people healthy and away from secondhand smoke. So years ago, we were working in a coalition of children's advocates and healthcare advocates trying to work on the prevention of youth access to tobacco. So we have a big coalition group. And what I like to do is go around and ask people what resources they bring to the table. And by that, I mean, and I don't just mean legislative resources, like who can bake cookies, because it's always helpful to take cookies to the secretaries, right? You want to keep everybody happy. So we were talking through the kinds of things that we could do together to raise awareness about this issue. And somebody kind of flippantly said, well, we could stage a mock funeral of all the people that have died of tobacco this year. Well, would you believe there was a gentleman in the coalition that said, well, you know, my uncle has a funeral parlor. Really? Long story short, what we did was we borrowed a hearse from this guy and a casket. We got donated flowers and a choir. And on the steps of the Capitol, on the South Steps, we staged a mock funeral for all those who had died of tobacco-related illnesses that year. There were over 7,000. And it didn't cost us anything. We had all the press there. And in fact, the very next day, there was a huge full color picture in the Tulsa World and the Oklahoman above the fold, talking about what we were trying to do. Didn't cost us a thing. And so I think if we just open our brains to think, who can bring what to the table? What are the resources out there to help us get done what we want to get done? We have a much better chance of just trying to do it by ourselves.
That is exactly right. And again, thank you enough for pointing that out. And we had a coalition meeting yesterday.
Yeah.
We have a coalition. We discussed this earlier, and it was pointed out how to get involved. Mark posted the information up at the top of the chat section. AAA, OSMA, OICA, the insurance companies are all working on trying to get the seatbelt law changed to take away the Scrivener's error that reduced our age overall to the lowest age in the nation, and then also trying to improve upon what we already had. And so that organization, meeting regularly with the coalition, understanding the partners that are involved. As last year we had 3 bills. This year we have 2, and the 2 solid authors, and they passed the bodies of origin, but then we're stalled because of the pandemic. So we're working together to try and get everything passed this year. So it's so important to have that collaboration and that organization, and to track the bills and know where they're at in the process so you can keep your advocates informed.
Well, the other thing to remember is that it only takes 51 votes to pass something. And a lot of times, you know, we as Oklahomans, we're very kind, we're polite people. We want everybody to be happy. But in the end, I mean, there are going to be, when we first asked that we have seatbelts in cars, you would have thought, oh my goodness, it was the most terrible thing because it was taking away our freedoms and all this stuff. But in the end, we had to, you know, you try to give good arguments to people, but if they are again you, they're again you. But sometimes you just have to, what I call, bless and release. So you bless their hearts, and you don't want to make any enemies. You don't say, I'm going to make sure you never get reelected. No. You can still be kind and polite, but you can say, you know, we're going to have to agree to disagree on this one. I'll catch you on the next round. And then go ahead with what you know, you have 70 votes or whatever. So just do what you can with what you've got.
And knowing when to compromise. I know on the last seatbelt law that passed, my predecessor, Jim Clover, was heavily involved in that. And part of that compromise was making sure farm tags didn't have the seatbelt inclusion in there.
Right.
Because the farmers, as they argued, didn't want to have to take their seatbelt off when they were opening the gates to their pasture. And so to get something, you had to give a little bit. And we did get a very good law in place for the children of the state who were covered under that. And that's just something we're working to try and get done now.
Right, right. Well, I see we have one more minute. Is there any one last question I can answer? All right. Well, thanks, guys. Have a great day.
And thank you so much. I'm sure everyone on here knows our People's Choice Award at the Heroes Ball, the individual and the organizational award are named after Ann and the work that she accomplished as our longest serving executive director. We appreciate you being so involved with us still and being active, and can't thank you enough for everything you have done, everything you are still doing, and everything that you will do.
Always my pleasure. Always my pleasure.
And with that, we are going to wrap up. I'm sure it's going to tick there. It just ticked noon. So we are right on time today. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of the day 2 on the Legislative Learning Lab. We will see you back here tomorrow. We have an amazing slate of speakers tomorrow as well. And we'll get ready for the big day on Monday to hear the state of the state and know what's coming forth from the governor and ideas from the legislature. Take your homework, go look at that website, do some searching, play around with that, and then watch for our press release next week. We'll have a list of our top targets of what OICA is going to be working with. And if you have suggestions for us of things you see, shoot them our way. Thank you for being a part of this, and we will see you tomorrow.